We're here this morning because there's a story we love to tell about Charlotte, Mecklenburg as a place where anyone can make it. And it goes something like this. The Queen City is a can-do community that doesn't have a harbor or a majestic mountain, nor does it serve as a seat of government that would make it a natural place for a top 20 American city to emerge. Instead, people come here and thrive here because they believe they can find opportunity. Want to get ahead? Looking for a place to build a future? Go to Charlotte. We think of ourselves as the meritocracy in America today. Well, to the surprise of many of us, we have learned there is much more work to do for that opportunity story to ring true for more people in our community. And not just for our generation, but for the future generations to come. And not just for those who move here, but also for those who are born here. The foundation is committed to joining with all of you to help make that happen. As we learn more about our local and national opportunity landscape this morning, I leave you with a simple thank you for taking time from busy schedules to be here this morning. And I invite each of you to join the emerging movement to make a difference. So let's get started. I welcome to the stage my colleague, Brian Collier. Brian, we are all yours.
So I think it appropriate that we're here in the theater that I give you a little bit of an analogy to tell you why I was up all night. If you go to a theater, they typically hand you a playbill and tell you who's in the cast for that night. And sometimes you'll get a little insert that says, in place of our starring character, you're going to get an understudy. So unfortunately, Richard Reeves had a family illness that he had to deal with. And so he sends his regrets. And we went back and forth all day yesterday with trying to figure out all kinds of ways to get Richard here. But unfortunately, his role as a father took precedent over his role as a moderator. So I stayed up all night last night, watching Downton Abbey, trying to perfect an accent. But instead, I sounded like Eliza Doolittle, and as someone said last night, almost a mix of Sean Connery, so I'm going to drop that whole thing. So I'm not going to do that. But we will miss him, but his presence is here, and he, as we have dubbed him, is an honorary Charlottean. He has fallen in love with the community and is our consultant on this whole process. So think of his family, and obviously he will be here, and think of me today as I'm asking questions of this great panel. So, as Michael mentioned, this is our third in a series that we're calling Leading on Opportunity. And what we're trying to do is take this community through an educational opportunity to look at this issue, to look beyond the headline. You know, we all got hung up at the very beginning around this 50th of 50, and we have moved well beyond that, especially those of you who have been with us since the beginning. You understand how nuanced this issue is. I do want to let you know that our next speaker, just for your calendar purposes, will be May 18th, and it is Robert Putnam. And as you know, Robert has a fantastic book that is now out called Our Kids, and obviously he has a long history here with Charlotte, and so we're looking forward to having Robert here the evening of May the 18th, and we'll send you details on that. So I'm going to walk you through the logistics for this morning. First, I'm going to let you know who's behind this in terms of our sponsors and contributors. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the logistics for the day, and then I'm going to talk to you about how the question and answer session will go. So first of all, I'm very proud to let you know that our national guests today are Joe Jones from the Center for Urban Families in Baltimore, Maryland, Bruce Katz, Director of the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institution and author of The Metropolitan Revolution, which I know many of you have read, and maybe even some of you heard him last night or yesterday. Russell Krumnow from Opportunity Nation in D.C., and Scott Winship, the Walter B. Wriston Fellow at the Manhattan Institute in D.C. as well. And then we're going to have a local panel come up, made up of Debra Campbell from the city of Charlotte, our assistant city manager, Raquel Lynch, chief program officer at Crisis Assistance Ministry, and Dee O'Dell, who is with U.S. Bank, but he's also the co-chair, as many of you know, of the Opportunity Task Force that we're now in the process of putting together. And before that, we're going to bring up Owen Furseth, who's going to go through some of the data that we all, again, a lot of us have that, what we call the Chetty data, meaning the data that led to the 50th of 50 in our heads. Now, Owen is going to spend a little bit of time this morning bringing that data home to Charlotte, making it, giving you a little bit better picture of what the situation is here on the ground in our community. But before we go forward tonight, I do have to thank all of the partners who are joining with us, not only on this series, but also on the work that we're doing with the task force. The City of Charlotte, Mecklenburg County, the J.M. Belk Endowment, Z. Smith Reynolds, the John S. and John L. Knight, James S. and John L. Knight Foundation, and obviously ourselves, the Foundation for the Carolina. And please know that as we move forward with this, we're going to be adding additional partners to the table. A lot of organizations, a lot of funders have been interested in this, and we're looking forward to adding them. Just a quick update on where we are with the task force. I know many of you are anxious to know when that will be named. We will be coming out with that list in approximately 3 weeks or so, right around, hopefully right after most people get through with their spring breaks for schools. But we're hoping to have that within the next 3 weeks. We have had, as I'm sure you can imagine, this has been an unbelievable Herculean effort to try to pull this task force together because so many people have ideas of who should be on it. How are we going to, within just a finite number of people, how do we get representatives from across our community? And so it will be a list that I think many of you will say, yes, I get that person. I don't know who that person is. I wonder why they put that person on. We're going to explain all that to you at the right time. But I'm very honored by the people who have helped us put that list together. Their initial focus will be gathering information and mapping what the current opportunity culture looks like in Charlotte. And then they will engage the community, many of you, and out into the community, in a robust discussion and input on options as recommendations. Then there will be some regular reporting back to you and back to the community on what they're doing, their progress, the creation of dashboards and things like that. And then a lot of different engagement opportunities along the way to make sure that we keep this issue in the forefront, including additional speaker series that we bring in. So let me walk you through today. First of all, we're going to get a local look at opportunity from Owen's data. But as you hear Owen's data, reflect on the fact that we have successfully faced challenges before we came to know about this issue of opportunity. And we are currently responding, even though it's not as strategic as we would want, we are responding. Many of you are already doing things to address this issue of opportunity for our young children. And you should be proud of that. Our goal is, how do we take all of this information and do it better and become committed to the fact that this is not a 2, 5, or even a 10-year response. This is a 20, 30, 40-year response. Then second, I'm going to get to some national perspectives from our key folks that are here today. You're going to hear from 4 nationally recognized experts, and I'll introduce them when they come up to the stage. But I want you to know one important note about them. Each of these offer a different perspective on the opportunity question. We're honored to have each of these perspectives at the table today, and they'll offer their thoughts within the context of their knowledge and their organization's work. Some of this information will include data about race and family structure, and I want you to understand that we all know that the panel that you'll see does not reflect in total the diversity that we have in our community. So this is not the conversation that we're going to end with around this issue of race and family structure. This is the beginning, mostly with data, to help us move forward. We will engage in much bigger issues, discussions about this. The task force will certainly have this as a topic. Then we're going to ask some questions of our national experts. I'm going to ask some questions as the moderator, and then we have 3 local leaders who will also come up to ask some questions. Our first session when our first 2 sessions, we actually offered everyone an open mic to also ask questions. I think in this venue that would be relatively difficult, so we're going to give you 2 ways that you can ask questions. First of all, I hope that our local leaders will also be asking those questions that are on your mind. But there's 2 other ways for you to ask the question. First is, hopefully you received a note card, a comment card in your packet. Please take that, write a question, pass it down. We'll do our best to try to get you that question asked of our panel. And then secondly, there will be a Twitter hashtag. It's opportunity, hashtag, the number sign, opportunity CLT. If you hashtag to that question, to Twitter to that hashtag, we'll get those questions and hopefully get a chance to ask those as well. I'm going to put that up in a little bit as well. So again, I want to remind you of our next event, which is May the 18th with Robert Putnam. And I hope that, again, we don't know that we've set the venue yet, but it will be one that will accommodate a large crowd. And so before I want to turn over the agenda to Owen, I want to share with you 3 thoughts. And I've mentioned these at each of the sessions and many times when I've met with individuals in this room on a more personal basis. First of all, think through this as the conversations are unwinding today. First of all, what's the bigger narrative to be told here? The point of today is not to get caught up in the data points, but to be mindful of the larger narrative we'd like to create here in Charlotte. And is our story the story of opportunity for America, at least the vision that we all have? So what's the bigger narrative we want to tell? What's the headline look like 20, 30, 40 years from now? Second, is this an opportunity for collective impact? This is a huge challenge. This is a year's generational long challenge. Perhaps the biggest challenge our community has ever faced. We all have a role, each of you who are doing wonderful work in the community. Meeting challenges nationally and locally will require cross-sector collaboration and a strategy for collective impact. So what are you doing? What do you bring to the table that helps address this issue, and how can we all work together? And then finally, this idea of commitment. I think we all are familiar with the work of task force that do wonderful work, publish a fantastic looking and stocked with information report at the end, and then it doesn't go anywhere. My commitment to you on behalf of the foundation is that's not going to be allowed to happen, at least in the areas where we have authority to act. This is something that we are committed to. We will move forward as much as we can, but as I said, it takes all of us and people who are not in this room today to make this a reality. So my plea, my challenge to all of this is, how do we think about this as a commitment that spans a long period of time, one that will probably extend beyond at least the professional careers of many of the people in this room, but will impact the children who are born today, tomorrow, the day after. So with that, I'd like to introduce Owen Furseth to come up and give us a little bit of the data on what the current challenges here in North Carolina and Charlotte. So many of you know Owen, but he's the Associate Provost for Metropolitan Studies and Extended Academic Programs at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He's also a Professor of Geography. Prior to joining UNCC, first Owen was employed as an urban and regional planner in Florida and a planning educator in Oregon. Since '97, he has served as the principal investigator for the City of Charlotte's Neighborhood Quality of Life Studies. Furseth's current research interests are centered around community planning, especially social and community change associated with Latino immigration. So with that, I'll add that Owen has always been a great friend to the foundation, along with all of the individuals at the Urban Institute. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, good morning to everyone. Before I begin my remarks, I do want to acknowledge the very important assistance I had on the presentation today from Laura Simmons, who's a researcher at the Urban Institute. I basically get to give the slides. Laura was the one who did all the hard work in putting it together, and we all know what that means in terms of outcome. So if you're a short-term Charlottean, a native Charlottean, or a long-term Charlottean, this is what we're used to. We are used to seeing, as both Brian and Michael introduced, we are used to seeing Charlotte as this place of superlatives, a place that is always breaking the bounds, always moving forward, always achieving what we aspire to be. So back in the summer of 2013, when this new headline appeared in the community, all of a sudden we were shocked, we were dismayed, we basically couldn't figure out what was going on, because this is not the Charlotte we know, this is not the Charlotte that we've come to expect in terms of what our community offers in the way of opportunity and what our community aspires to be in terms of a place moving forward. So the question then became, where did this information come from? I mean, this has got to be a crackpot study, right? It can't be accurate in terms of saying that we are at the bottom in terms of climbing out of poverty. But in fact, it was a very well-researched, very thoughtful study done by a team of economists at Harvard University in conjunction with colleagues at the University of California at Berkeley. It was an intergenerational analysis of poverty and opportunity in the United States. And essentially, and I believe you all have copies of the slides, right? So essentially what this study did was, with a very sophisticated methodology, the researchers said, what are the chances for a child succeeding independently of family status or environment based on where she grows up? So what is the intergenerational mobility in terms of economic mobility for a child? The study was quite large. They looked at a sample of all the children born in the United States between 1980 and 1981. They then took the children, paired them with their parents, so we had children linked back to parents in terms of income level, based on 741 commuting zones, so it covered the entire United States. So where you were growing up, and then where you were as an adult, where these children were as an adult. So 30 years forward, looking at the income data of children compared to parents, and their positions relative to the national income distribution. So the kids started out at one level, looking 30 years out, comparing them to their parents, and what was the change that you could see in terms of income attainment between the child and their parents, and how is that affected by the communities in which you lived? So how is that affected by this environment in which you are growing up? And when they did this, they essentially came up with the results that were the background for that headline. And so what we've done with this slide is we've taken, and this was part of the headline, the 50 largest metros in the United States, the 50 largest metropolitan regions. Essentially, if you will, think about this as a race. And so the starting line at the race is all of the kids born into the 25th percentile level. So their parents' income when they were born was at the 25th percentile. So they're below average, right? So we got all the kids, they're all on the line, and they all race out. And we're like 30 years down the road in terms of what they've achieved. And we could see at the top of the list are the kids in the Salt Lake City metro area. And the level of achievement there is a change from rank 25th to rank 46. Okay. So essentially they're moving almost to the middle rank in terms of that income level. And they represent, if you will, the exemplar. They represent the best possible outcome for this. We can look at some of the cities that we tend to compare ourselves with. Minneapolis, Portland, Kansas City, the cities that we think about as our peers and the cities we aspire to become. And then we'll throw in Atlanta, right, because it's out there. And Raleigh, it's down the road a little bit, so we'll throw in them. And then Charlotte at the very bottom, where rather than being 46% in terms of increase, we're at 36%. So we're at the bottom of our peer, of the national cities, and certainly at the bottom in terms of the peer cities. And this is where the data are coming from in terms of that headline that I showed at the beginning. So I'm a geographer, as Brian said. So we're going to see lots of maps today. This is the first one. So this is a map displaying how those various commuting zones turned out in terms of the analysis, the 30-year change that we talked about. And the areas in blue are the areas that were at the top of the scale. They did the best. And then the yellow and the oranges were at the bottom of the scale in terms of outcomes. So they were Charlotte and the other underperformers. So if we look at this map, what we see are a couple of things in terms of kind of broad geographic patterns. Number one, the South, the Southeast, and in particular the Southeast areas, communities with large African American populations tended to be underperformers. That's number one. Okay. But I would say that the outcomes are not racial because whites in these areas also were underperformers. So these communities as a whole were underperformers. Okay? The second thing we see, if you're familiar with the concept of the Rust Belt, or you came from Pennsylvania or Ohio or places like that, or know folks up there, those areas were underperformers. So those areas were communities that have undergone decades of bad economies. The jobs have left. The industries have left. Okay? So these are areas that have suffered. They've been losing population. Wage levels are going down. It's not a good situation. And the third pattern, which is a little less obvious up there, but some of you may see it, is areas with large concentrations of Native Americans, or large concentrations of indigenous people in the United States. So these are the three kind of macro national geographic trends that we see evidence in terms of the data. Okay? So let's drill down and look at Charlotte at the bottom compared to Salt Lake City at the top. And I know this is a very geeky chart, so we'll go through it very simply so we can all understand it. But essentially what Chetty and his colleagues did was to take that income data for these children and their parents and to divide it into quintiles. So to divide it into 5 groups. So this is going to work. Over here, we have the top income group in terms of the study. And down here, we have the bottom income group. And then across here, what we've done is we've taken those data and we've divided them, or we parsed them into performance in terms of improvement from quintile to quintile. So in other words, everything up here represents a child born into one of these quintiles moving at least into the next quintile up. With me on that? Okay. So I think with that kind of introduction, and you can see then Charlotte on the left in terms of the pairs of bars, and Salt Lake City on the right. And so we can start by looking at the top end, and we can see that the children born into that top quintile, about 67 to 69% in the case of Salt Lake, actually moved down. Okay. So they were moving from that highest, most advantaged, richest group to another quintile below. Okay. They can't go up, so they've got to go down. At the other end of the scale, we have the children born into the bottom quintile. And you can see here the differences starting to appear with 72% of the Salt Lake children moving out of that quintile, moving up, if you will, in terms of economic opportunity, versus Charlotte, it's only 62%. So we've got a 10% gap there, which is significant. But I want to call your attention to 2 other pieces of data up there because I think they are even more informative in terms of talking about what's going on in the community and the issues we need to consider. If we look at that middle quintile, the kids born into the middle class, the average, you can see a difference in terms of what is going on there between Charlotte and Salt Lake City, with far more of the kids from Salt Lake City moving up either into the 4th or the 5th quintile versus 34% in terms of Charlotte. But I think even more distressing is what's going on in terms of downward movement. Look at that. So in Salt Lake, or in the case of Charlotte, 43% of the children in that middle quintile, in that middle class quintile, were actually going down. So they were born into a middle class environment, but in the course of that generation, in the course of that 30 years, their income level was actually falling into a lower quintile. Versus their peers in Salt Lake City, where it was 30%, which is significant, no doubt, but it's certainly less than what we were observing in Charlotte. Okay? Other quintile I want to take a look at in talking in a little bit more depth is that second quintile. So these are kids who are not born into the poorest families, but these are kids who are born into the families that are on the edge of poverty. The lower middle class, the families that are right there on the cusp, potentially of falling into poverty. And indeed, when we look at the data, what we see is in Charlotte, that is what was occurring during the study period. We can see that in case of Charlotte, almost a third of those kids, 29%, actually were falling back into that lower quintile versus 20% for Salt Lake City. And then look at the upward mobility, 60% for Salt Lake City versus 43%. So the story, I think, that we see from these particular data are not simply kids moving up in terms of economic opportunity, but kids who are sustained, staying where they were, or more critically, maybe even moving down. So it's a tale of two-directional change occurring here. Upward mobility, which is modest compared to Salt Lake City for Charlotte, but also downward mobility, which is much more significant in terms of what's going on. All right? So those were the data from the Chetty study, and there are, of course, national data that tell us that this process of economic mobility is often linked back at the national level, and these are data from the Pew Center rather than the Chetty study, linked back to the conditions or the attributes of the households involved. So here, the first set of data are for African Americans, and what we're looking at here, again, is quintile data. So think about those 5 groups that we talked about. And what we can see is that among African Americans in the Pew study, 45% were moving upward from the bottom quintile. And of that, 25% were moving up at least to the middle quintile. So they may be going to the middle class, or they may be going to the upper class, theoretically. But we can see it's 45 and 25 versus white families, where it's 68% moving up, so quite a significant difference. And in terms of making it to something beyond just the next quintile up, it's 35%. And then finally, the data here display the impact of family earnings for single earning families versus double earning families. And you can see, again, impact that having 2 wage earners in a family makes versus having a single wage earner in terms of outcome. So, talked about the Chetty data, kind of hopefully set the stage for you in terms of drilling down and now talking about Charlotte. But the Chetty data, remember, were for 1980 through a 30-year period. So it's change over time that was not the contemporary, but was in the past. Okay? But more importantly, if we drill down a little bit more on the methodology behind the Chetty data, it was a very sophisticated statistical analysis. Again, they were looking at income levels. They actually had access to income tax returns. They started out with 35 independent variables, the dependent variable being that economic opportunity or mobility variable that we've been focusing on. But they had 35 variables. They had them grouped into 10 separate categories. So there are 10 domains of data. And then in the end, based on statistical significance, they identified 5 really important variables. 5 variables that were good predictors of that income mobility. And those 5 variables were those bullets you see up there. Those 5 variables were able to explain about 76% of the income mobility for all the kids and their parents in the study, which is very high in terms of outcome. And the variables they identified were segregation, which I'll talk a little bit more about as we get into the local slides, income inequality, quality of school system, social capital, and family structure. So what I want to do now for the remainder of my time is to take these variables that were so important in the Chetty study and look at what is going on in Charlotte-Mecklenburg today when we think about these data, hopefully to inform the conversation that Brian has talked about going forward in terms of economic opportunity. Okay? First, when we talk about segregation, we're talking about people separated from other people based on characteristics like income, race, and ethnicity. And in the Chetty study, they were also looking at how far you were traveling from your home place to your workplace. Geographers call this journey to work. And the longer it takes, the more time it takes, the more cost it takes. What they found was that was a significant factor in explaining the lack of mobility. I would suggest to you that that distance between home and place also relates to things like the availability of housing, the price of housing, income levels, ethnicity, things like that. So it's a very complex sort of variable. So we don't really have a slide showing that, although we've got data that we're preparing for the foundation that does show that. So let's look at the variables then around segregation. This is a very, I think, first a very busy map, but also one very informative, okay, as long as you're not colorblind. And what it shows you is each of those dots represents 10 people living in Mecklenburg County. And those dots are coded by race and ethnicity. And when you look up there, what you can see is that we as a community are very segregated based on race and ethnicity. Now, at this scale, and from where you are, you're probably seeing very broad patterns. So you can see that Southeast Charlotte wedge, or you can see the neighborhoods north of downtown, or you can see the north end of Mecklenburg County standing out. But I would submit to you that if you drill down and look at a smaller, finer grain scale of neighborhoods, these patterns are going to persist. So that we have racially identifiable, not just portions of this county, but racially identifiable, ethnically identifiable neighborhoods across the county. Now, when we take these points of location and we statistically analyze them, we find that Asians, as a group, tend to be the most integrated in the community. And Latinos tend to be the second most integrated group, but both of those are the smallest group. Both of those are relatively newcomers to our community. So when we look at the traditional demography of Mecklenburg County, which is African American and white, and you can see it up there in terms of the green and the blue, there's very strong patterns of housing segregation that still exist. Another area of segregation in our community beyond race is economy. Researchers at the Fraser Prosperity Institute, which is associated with the business school at the University of Toronto, have been looking at metropolitan regions across the United States, looking at segregation based on wealth and class. And when they do their national analysis, the Charlotte metro area shows up as the 9th most segregated metropolitan region in terms of where the wealthy live relative to the less wealthy, where college-educated folks live, and where the working class live relative to the rest of the population. So we have segregation on wealth as well as on class lines. And what Laura has done for us in these two maps is to take the most recent census data that are available from the American Community Survey, and on the left to map the percentage of households with income above $200,000, and then to present that with the darker colors being census tracts where the, again, household income, percent of household income above $200,000 is greater than 15%. Look at the map on the left. That's showing you where the very wealthy folks live in Mecklenburg County. And then look at the map on the right, which displays individuals living in poverty. So for the same period of time, where are people who are poor, individuals who are poor living, and those darker colors represent census tracts where it's 30% or greater. Think about that. 30% of the people living in those census tract individuals are defined as poor based on the census standards. Okay? And then look at the two images you see in terms of the maps. This mirror opposite sort of a phenomenon in terms of what is going on. And think about the data coming out of the Fraser Institute. Schools are a very powerful reflection of what is going on in terms of segregation, whether it be racial or economic, in any community. And it certainly is evidenced in terms of these two maps, which we put together, showing the location of schools which are identified as high poverty, so that's 80% of the students or more qualify for free or reduced lunch, or high minority, which in this case is 80% of the students in those schools are classified as children of color. So we put those two variables together and we look at schools across CMS. The map on the left is 2001. Does anybody remember the significance of 2001? Bill Anderson, what was that?
Changed the way we assign students to school.
The end of busing. So in 2001, we had 10 schools in the county that were highly segregated in terms of poverty, in terms of race. These are data from 2013. We're up about 51 schools. And look at, again, the geographer in me keeps looking at those maps. I'm going to train you all to be geographers by the end of this presentation. Keep looking at those maps because these patterns are going to persist. Okay, any income inequality is the second variable that the Chitty study talked about. I think a very instructive graph here that Laura again put together. If we take the total income in Mecklenburg County, $30.5 billion in 2013, we divide that into income quintiles, back to that quintile term, and at the bottom you can see where the boundary is to the bottom quintile, 24,000 to 43 to 67 to 115, and then we distribute that $30.5 billion in terms of income across Mecklenburg County. You can see that 53% of the income is in that top earning group. And the bottom two, 40%, bottom two quintiles, 11%. There is, within the community, within Charlotte-Mecklenburg, an income gap based on race and ethnicity. We take the median household income and we look for white households, African American, Hispanic, Latino. What we've done is drawn a poverty level line of 4, or for a family of 4 across there, which is 23,000. And you can see the dramatic difference between what median income is for African Americans and Hispanics relative to Asians and whites. Asset poverty, a term that Raquel knows very well, on how this plays out. Essentially, a very simple definition for asset poverty is that if you lost your income for 3 months, would you find yourself in poverty? And when we look at how this plays out locally across those racial and ethnic groups, you can see almost a reverse from that past slide, right? Perhaps not unexpectedly in terms of African Americans and Latinos presenting over half of our community, and those two ethnic racial groups would be in this asset poverty category. Quality of the school system, another variable that was in the Chetty study, is a powerful predictor. We could talk about school differences in many ways. What we've done today is to simply drill down on one variable that is at the center of community discussion and community action, which is third grade reading level. Some of you in the room have been involved, I'm sure, in some of the conversations about third grade reading level. What this map displays is the school performance, individual school performance, but system-wide, 47%, around half of third graders were proficient at the end of grade 3 when they took those reading tests. And if you're an economically disadvantaged student, that proficiency drops down to 29%. And what the map is showing you, look at the blue and the dark blue dots. Those are the schools that are performing at or above the CMS average. The schools that are not in blue or dark blue are below the average. And again, layer in your mind the maps that we've been looking at in terms of income level and in terms of all of these other variables to think about the cumulative effect of what's going on. Social capital was also in the study. Social capital is a reflection of how connected people are to each other and to civic institutions. Robert Putnam, who's coming in May, as Brian has indicated, is the author of the original National Social Capital Study, the baseline study. Charlotte was included in that study. Charlotte did well on some indicators, but in the area of interracial trust, we scored 39th out of 40. And what we've done at the Urban Institute at UNC Charlotte is to take those baseline data in 2001 for Mecklenburg County and to survey 2 additional times, the most recent time in 2011, to see what changes have occurred in social capital. So here's the interracial trust on the original Putnam study. The percentage here is the number of respondents who scored high. In other words, I have high interracial trust. And you can see very modest gains since 2001. In giving and volunteering, people scoring high has actually gone down. And in terms of social trust, very modest, almost marginal sorts of gain in that variable as well. Another way of thinking about this issue of social capital is civic engagement. The Chetty study and other studies done by political scientists often use voting behavior, participating in the election process as a metric for civic engagement, basically theorizing that if you feel connected to the community and if you trust institutions, you will go out and vote. If you are less connected to your community, you're less involved with your civic institutions, you choose not to vote. So when we look at Mecklenburg County in 2000 and 2012, we can see that 58% voted in 2000, and 12 years later it's up to 67%. Both of these are presidential election years, so they are somewhat equivalent. So that looks really good. But then when we look back at that map, when we look across the county, we see that there is a broad range of differences in terms of how many people are turning out and voting where you live and the neighborhoods in which you live. And if you think back to those earlier maps we saw about where people live of various economic status or various ethnic or racial status, you can see that the high-income areas, the areas that tend to be whiter, have higher rates of participation than do areas with African-American populations or Latino populations. So here, another kind of indicator or surrogate for the civic social capital. The final variable that was in the Chetty study, and I know I'm running over time, Brian, I apologize, is looking at the importance or the distribution of single-parent households. When all the variables were taken together in the Chetty study, this single-parent household variable turned out to be one of the most powerful predictors in terms of the model. And what we know, to begin with, from an economic perspective, based on the data from the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center, is that if you are a family of 3, 1 adult, 2 children, life can be really tough in Mecklenburg County and Charlotte. Okay? What the center has done, the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center has done, is to calculate the monthly expenses for a family of 3, housing, food, child care, transportation, other necessities, taxes, and it comes to over $4,000 a month. When you take that and you think about the annual need, then $48,000 a year, what this means is you need an hourly wage of $23 an hour. What's the minimum wage? So you need 3 minimum wage jobs if you're at that level in order to make ends meet in terms of being this single-parent household. The number of single-parent households is growing in Mecklenburg County. There's 47,000 single-parent households in the county. 38% of these have 38% of households with children are single-parent households, and that's gone up from 31% in 2000. Okay? So think about that previous slide, that 3-person family in terms of 1 breadwinner, 2 children, and the fact that 38% of the households in the county are single-parent households. And then when we look at the distribution, again, put on your geographer eyes again, look at the distribution and you can see the concentration of those households in parts of Charlotte and in parts of Mecklenburg County. Okay. All right, I started out with a set of headlines. the wonderful superlatives that we identify with and we think about ourselves as a community and what we aspire to be. The question becomes then for the conversation today and going forward for the task force and later meetings is, are these headlines for all of us? What about this headline here? What does it say in terms of, is this Charlotte? Is this Charlotte? Maybe the question becomes a new headline. How can we, and as Brian has indicated, this is not something that's going to be done overnight, but how can we write a new headline for Charlotte that says that Charlotte is the new land of opportunity? So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
So that could be taken as obviously a very gloomy picture of the current state of our community, at least for some. But this is all about how do we figure out how to move beyond that into creating this new headline. So to help us with that discussion, I'm going to ask our 4 panelists to come up at this moment. By the way, as they're walking up, just to remind you, if you do have articles that you want us to see and read on from any publication in the country, on opportunity, please make sure you send them to thoughtbox@fftc.org. We are creating quite a catalog, many of whom, the authors of which are up there on the stage today, but just to keep that in the back of your mind at all times. Then reminder, the hashtag is up there at the top, hashtag OpportunityCLT. So we thought what we would do is give each of our panelists a few minutes to talk about what their organization or how they think through opportunity. As you can tell, it's a diverse group of individuals up here in terms of their background and their organization. So we have individuals who are looking at this from a macro metropolitan level, like what is the opportunity for local communities versus our federal government? You know, how long do you have to wait on the federal government before cities just say we're going to act? We have other individuals who academically are looking at this issue and pulling it apart, trying to clarify, because I think a lot of times when we look at these issues, we come with a prejudice or with an idea that sometimes reflects our political backgrounds and things like that. So we want to make sure that we also have people who look at this data maybe from just a little different perspective. So we've got an individual up here to talk a little bit about that. Person who's living it day in and day out from an organization, trying to build, as we, even with, we kind of clapped when we talked about Richard's commitment to his family. Joe lives that every day, trying to instill this sense of fatherhood, commitment at the organizational level, has a powerful story of his own. And then we have an individual who represents an organization that, again, at the federal level, is trying to look at how do we create opportunity for youth across the country at the federal level, and then bring it down and highlight some of these issues at the state level about how your state and your community is doing. So thrilled to have each of them. To my left is Bruce Katz, as we mentioned, at Brookings Institute. Next to him, Joe Jones at Center for Urban Families in Baltimore, Maryland. Next to him, Scott Winship at the Manhattan Institute, and Russell Krumnow at Opportunity Nation. So I'm going to go in order of their position next to me. Bruce, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. First of all, just kudos to the foundation for hosting this, taking ownership, taking responsibility, and Owen, that was superb. And so what I want to do is talk about the economic side of economic opportunity from a macro and then a metro perspective, and then really talk about collective impact and how this level, the city and the metropolis, is the level to disrupt those trends. If you look at the macro picture in the United States, from 2000, 81 million people living in poverty and near poverty, to 2011, 107 million people living in poverty and near poverty. We've got some deep structural challenges in the United States. Productivity keeps going up. Wages are stagnating. This has been happening for decades. And frankly, from our perspective, it's because we have been on the wrong track for some period of time. We have the wrong growth model in the United States. We have a growth model pre-recession really characterized by consumption and debt. We need to get back to fundamentals. And fundamentals basically means an economy that is fueled by innovation, not just idea generation, but production, making things again. An economy that is powered by skilled workers, particularly workers coming out of high schools and community colleges with STEM skills and high-quality modern infrastructure. An economy that then is driven by exports and foreign direct investment and immigration and global engagement, because the foundation of cities is trade, frankly, because that's how you become wealthy and prosperous as a community. And if you do all those things, we think you build an economy over time that's rich with opportunity. Minor problem, to change your growth model, it would be helpful to have a national government. The national government, like Elvis, has left the building. And frankly, most states, like Elvis, have left the building, and yours is one of them. So what is happening in the United States is a shifting downward, a devolution of responsibility to cities and metropolitan areas. Because you are the engines of our economy. You are the centers of trade and investment. You are on the vanguard, the front lines of all the big disruptive trends and dynamics, demographic transformation, this economic opportunity agenda, income inequality, social mobility, climate change, right? You can't duck what's going on in this country, and you have power. You have resources. Power is very diffused in the United States, not just to local government, but cities essentially are networks of business, civic, university, labor, government, other leaders. You know, the federal government is a government. States are governments. That's why they can be hijacked by partisanship and ideological polarization and essentially do nothing or do harm. This is a network, and today you have a network here. I think what's going to happen in the United States, from a structural perspective, not a cyclical perspective. It's not like, in 3 years suddenly Mitch McConnell's going to wake up and say, I really want to get along with Democrats. It's not going to happen. So what structurally is going to happen is the federal government, because of the aging of our society, because of other pressures, is essentially going to become a healthcare company with an army. And the real challenge around investing in the future, in infrastructure, in schools, in skills, in our children, in the quality of place, because that's so fundamentally related to innovative economic growth, is going to come down to this level. And you're essentially going to have to sort out, based on your own distinctive advantages and assets and position in the global economy, what is your vision and how are you going to go about design, financing, and delivering it. The cavalry is not coming. You essentially are on your own. If anything helpful happens from the federal and state level, it will probably be an accident. So 3 things you have to do, and then I'll stop. A, be the network. I mean, really build, create, steward a network of your public, corporate, civic, university institutions and leaders, and collaborate to compete. You cannot do this each sector by itself, because essentially these is an integrated, multidimensional challenge, and therefore every sector has to contribute what it can contribute. Second, set your vision, as Owen has, on real evidence of who you are in the global economy. From our perspective at Brookings, what really matters is your advanced industries. Those industries that are basically fueled by research and development and STEM workers. Salt Lake City turns out to be really good because it's like up here on advanced industries. You're sort of medium, middling on advanced industries, right? Production, energy, and services. So understand who you are. For every job in advanced industries, 5 other jobs get created. And guess what? Not surprising. Advanced industries, large portion of jobs open to people with high school or community college degrees, and they pay really, really, really well because they're quality industries that are exporting abroad. Set your vision based on who you are, not some fanciful, delusional, we're going to be the next Silicon Valley. You will not be the next Silicon Valley. You can be the best 21st century version of yourself, essentially. Again, I always quote Dolly Parton. She should be up here today. That would be odd, but in any event, figure out who you are and do it on purpose. And last bit, game changers. What are the transformative investments? This is a very, very, very wealthy community. There is no reason why it can't have universal pre-K. There is no reason why you cannot have every child with access to a summer job. There's no reason why. I mean, we could go on and on and on and on. The national government will never do these things. The state government in this state will never do these things. This is the level that has to basically stand up, take responsibility, and help our children. Thank you very much.
I already have a lot of questions that I know they're going but I'm gonna hold off on those just a minute and say, Joe, tell us about what you're doing in Baltimore, maybe a little bit about your personal story, and why you think fatherhood, family structure is a key ingredient in this issue around opportunity.
Great. Well, first of all, can I mic check? Can you hear me? Hello? You can hear me now? A little bit better? Up.
There we go.
All right. So first of all, Brian, thank you all for having me to be here. Eli, thank you for connecting me to Brian and to the foundation. Still can't hear? Any better? Testing 1, 2, 3.
It's like my phone.
But where's your
It's on. Hello? There we go. Does that count against my 10 minutes?
You've got 2 minutes left.
It's funny when Brian he was talking about diversity. I look up here, it's like 4 white men, 1 black man, right? And the 1 black man doesn't have any hair. So basically, Bruce said what I would say, just more articulately. I completely agree with his approach and thinking about this. All of us come to what we do somewhat shaped by our own personal and family and community journeys, and I'm no different. I'm a father of 3. I have an older son that I had with a young lady out of wedlock. I met my wife. She had a daughter whose father was not engaged in her life, and that's my stepdaughter. And together, my wife and I had a 23-year-old son who had to have graduated with a degree in industrial engineering.
Fantastic.
He's got his first job, making some pretty good money, and he thinks he's a hell of a lot smarter than me. I agree with you to some extent, but when they start getting big-headed, it's a group of challenge. I'm also someone with age 13. I picked up a hypodermic needle full of heroin and injected it in my arm for 17 years. I was addicted to heroin, especially heroin and cocaine. And for that 17 years, I was also in and out of incarceration quite a bit, and I had my oldest son doing that journey. And I was very, very fortunate with a huge support system, including the God of my understanding, to be able to work through that madness. And in 1986, went to a long-term residential drug treatment facility, mainly the duck jail. Right? I've been in jail before, and I wasn't afraid to go to jail. Matter of fact, by the way, for those of us who think we can incarcerate our way out of addiction, I want you to know that every criminal justice institution I was in, I could get a hypodermic needle, the drug of my choice, the drugs of my choice, right, and inject them in the criminal justice institution. So the notion that we could incarcerate our way out of addiction is just completely false and a misnomer. But I took that opportunity because I was able to stay there for a year to turn my life around. For some of you who may know Dr. Freeman Rabowski at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, he's one of my biggest friends and mentors. And probably the main reason I ended up going back to school, because I was in a place where I was isolated in my own thinking and didn't have the capacity really to realize and take the steps necessarily to dream beyond my own circumstances. And you got to have people in your space to be able to help you think through those kind of situations. So I have many people like him, and I want to make sure that you understand that where you start is not where you end. And the notion that we have isolated pockets of just abject poverty where people have absolutely no chance of getting by and getting through is unconscionable. And even in some cases, when there is opportunity, the psychological barriers that prevent them from moving forward are just like their physical bars that prevent them from moving forward. So it's really difficult for people to kind of do the kind of things we're talking about when they're on. And, so after I worked through my own personal madness, I decided I wanted to, and I actually got an associate's degree in accounting. So you can imagine where the hell was I going to work with my criminal background in accounting. So I dispelled that whole notion of going to undergrad for accounting, ended up going to the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and focused on social work. And then I ended up, and just getting interested in politics, not to run, but because I understood how it drove so much of what was happening in our community. And then eventually I decided to create the Center for Urban Families in 1999. So 16 years later, we're a standalone nonprofit focusing on fatherhood, workforce development for men and women age 18 and above, and family strengthening. We also have a huge focus on policy advocacy. Some of the issues that the folks that we serve face can never be programmed out of. They're going to run up against policy barriers that will prevent them from moving forward, whether it's incarceration, child support, and other issues that we really have to give attention to. And then we have created a national arm of the organization called our Practitioners Leadership Institute, where we do training and technical assistance. And on the other side, we have a Practitioners Academy, where we identify 10 fellows annually to go through a cohort model to build capacity for them to have deeper impact in their respective communities. That as a context, this issue of father absence in our country, when we look at the data around single-parent households, those women, largely when we talk about single-parent households, not exclusively, largely we're talking about women, right? Those women had a child by a man, somewhere, generally speaking, and we've evolved in a society of science. You don't necessarily have a man all the time, right? But largely speaking, right, we've got a situation where men and women get together and something happens in the relationship and it disintegrates. And mothers bear the brunt of the responsibility of raising children. And men, for whatever reason, go off to do other things that are not necessarily associated with them being involved in the life of their children. Sometimes because of the animosity that exists between the man and woman. They can't work this stuff out. They can't co-parent. They don't have the skills, the capacity, or the understanding what it means to be engaged in their children's life if they're not going to be together romantically. And then you've got other people who just make personal choices that they don't necessarily need another partner to have a child. They want to move forward. But for the folks that we care about most, right? One of the things that we noticed that this out of wedlock birth rate, around 67% or so in the African American community, drives so much of the poverty that we see, and it creates cracks that our children fall through, and they can never climb back up to get up above ground. And so one of the things that we did was to basically indict states on being complicit in breaking up families. And what I meant by that is we have said to policymakers in our legislature in particular that when a poor woman gets pregnant and she goes to the welfare office, there's a subset of those pregnant women who are still in a relationship with the guy she has a child by, but the system doesn't recognize him as an asset or as being integral to the family. So what they say to the woman is, we're going to help you go from welfare to work. You are eligible for the state benefits. However, you got to give up the guy who you have pregnant by, and the system really works with him on paternity establishment and child support. It's not likely it's in his best interest to be with her at the time that she applies for those benefits, because there's perceived risk. Whether those risks are real or not, it's perceived in his mind as not in his best interest. And anybody here ever been in a relationship where you thought your partner was screwing around on you, but maybe he really wasn't, but if you thought he was, right, that's your reality. And for these guys, the perception is it's not safe for me to engage a public system around this family formation stuff because of the inherent risk around child support and the insurmountable debt that's often associated with debt for dead broke dads is so much of a barrier to them being connected with their family. So the system says, young lady, we're going to help you go from welfare to work, set to her partner who she says she's still interested in being with. We're going to help you go to wherever you are to debt, and you figure out how you're going to pay this child support. So that's what I meant when we indicted states on being complicit in breaking up families. I had that conversation at a policy talk in Hopkins in October 2011. One of our state legislators, Dr. Debra Sandy Rosenberg, came up to me, asked me if I knew what I was talking about. I was pretty sure. I've been engaged in this work for a while, right, in general terms, right? He came back and said, hey, can you write up your talk in a one-pager? I had given a 20-minute talk, so you try to write up a 20-minute talk in one page. Well, nonetheless, I talked to my team, we put it together, sent it to him. In 2012, he introduced a bill in the Maryland legislature that would require the state to change how they approach working with families we just described. The bill didn't go anywhere in 2012, but in 2013, he reintroduced the bill, passed the House a few weeks later, went to the Senate, passed it, and then in May of 2013, Governor O'Malley signed the bill into law. So we no longer have a bill, we have a law, right? What that law requires is that the State Department of Human Resources, so in Maryland it's called the Department of Human Resources, under which you have the TANF for the Welfare Office, the Child Support Office, and the Family Investment Office. All three of those hold domain over the families we just talked about. And it requires the state to work with us to pilot a model that when the mom applies for public benefits, it brings the guy closer to the table at the time that she applies for benefits. And we begin to work with them to do systems change while we're trying to also do a programmatic model. So the programmatic side of the equation, we bring cohorts of couples, 10 to 12 couples, together to go through relationship education. The difference in this approach, other than different from previous administration, is it attaches a huge emphasis on getting these families connected, these individuals connected to the labor force. And I want to switch to a slide. I have one slide. You see that slide there? So from your left to the right, here's an example of what we call our family stability and economic success on return on investment relative to the guys who are associated with the women we just talked about. So on your left-hand side, and I'm going to use a real example of a family that's engaged with the Center for Urban Families. The guy had served 9 years in prison. He came to us after he was released from incarceration. He had children by this woman. They were still romantically linked. She hung there with him while he was incarcerated. He came to us. Our investment in him is between $4,000 and $9,000, and that variable depends on whether or not he's in multiple programs, our fatherhood program and our workforce development program. You see the services that are provided to him under that domain. Then we go over to the employer side. So we have an employer partner who happens to be a Republican and a retired Marine. So I don't know if you can get much tougher than a Republican and a retired Marine. Right? But his company is Mechanical Engineering and Construction Corporation. That guy's name is Rich Beatty. Rich said to me, Joe, I'm willing to take a shot on your guys, right? But I'm only going to hire them during the hottest months of the year as laborers, because if they can't make it during that, then they have not passed my due diligence test. So we took them up on it. So they started $12 an hour. Then Rich came back and said, this is what I'm going to do, because these guys have really performed as opposed to what I usually get when I go through traditional advertising on recruitment services, right? He invests an additional $6,000 to $12,000 in the apprenticeship training. So each year, for the last 7 years, he's paid for those guys to go into a 4-year apprenticeship program. On the other side of the equation, to the far right, last year, each one of those guys made $50,000 as base salary, and with additional overtime and bonuses, they made up to $57,000, right? The guy who is the example of this, and I don't want to call him out because I would have asked him for permission to use his name, but I just came from Providence where it's cold as heck and I didn't have a chance to do that. But I will tell you that last year, in addition to what he's doing economically, he and his wife purchased their first home, right? So we're talking about real tangible benefits that have to be realized in the community. You can have all the theoretical conversations. It needs to be informed by academia, research, but on the ground, people have to have a sense of there is hope and there is opportunity. If we're talking about false hope with no opportunity, what you're going to do is get disenfranchised people and communities, and it will lead to ultimately the kind of segregation, all the things that we saw, and including the kind of stuff that goes on in Ferguson and other communities where you have social unrest. So you all have a really great opportunity because you're taking the first steps to do community engagement in a real, authentic kind of way. But I will tell you that you cannot have 4 white men and 1 black man without hair, right, as your only source of resource. You really have to drill down into your community. You have to build capacity in your community for the nonprofit organizations who are going to be the hub of services to the folks and help build that capacity. There are folks like me who have great ideas and great interests, but we don't know how to run nonprofits. We don't yet have the capacity to take on a relationship with a university where we start looking at rigorous evaluation, including randomized controlled trials. And almost every federal grant that comes out now relative to serving the families that we talk about includes some opportunity for practitioners or grantees to have to participate in randomized controlled trials. You can't start at randomized controlled trials in the communities where we're talking about. You got to build that infrastructure to take on rigorous evaluation. So those will be the kind of like takeaways and the opportunities I think that we need to consider as you advance this conversation. Thank you.
And Joe, you have our commitment that although this looks like it does today, this is not the way that it will go into the community in terms of how we go out, meet with people, do the work, the hard work that has to be done, bring a lot of different voices to the table. So you absolutely have our commitment on that. Scott, you have been called out by Aaron and Richard as someone who has this other, maybe a slightly different view than they would, I guess, label themselves as more progressive on this issue. Maybe you're a little bit right of the center. And they've said you have a challenge to them. You challenged some of the data, you challenged some of the thought. In every reading that I have of yours, I don't get the sense that you believe that there isn't an opportunity problem in our country, and that certainly race is a part of that problem. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on the issue.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, and thank you to the Foundation for inviting me and giving me a chance to be a small part of this. I think I was asked to come and give a non-doom and gloom kind of speech, which I'll do a little bit of, but I do think that we have some serious mobility challenges in the country, and I'm doing as much as I can to convince other conservatives of that. And so I will have some doom and gloom, I think, towards the end of my remarks. I mean, the first thing that I think I want to say, kind of working off of some of the points of Bruce and Joe, I don't think there are any easy answers to how you increase upward mobility, particularly the kind that Owen was talking about and that I think the Chetty report is focused on and that you all care about so much, which is moving people from the bottom up and keeping people who are in the middle from moving down. By the way, those goals are somewhat incompatible, right? To move some people out of the bottom to the middle. Some people from the middle are going to have to move down. So just keep that in mind. It's an unfortunate political, mathematical reality. In terms of economic growth, some of the things that Bruce mentioned, that's something that can benefit everybody. If you get the economy growing, everybody moves up. And that's really important. I think it's important not to minimize that at all. And as part of your strategy, I think that needs to be first and foremost in your minds. On the other hand, if everybody becomes better off over time, but you're the kid of a security guard and you want to be a lawyer, but it turns out you're no more able to be a lawyer than you were 20 years ago. You're a much better paid security guard, maybe. That's not an acceptable situation either. So I think you really have to have both the absolute mobility goal in mind and the relative mobility goal. Okay, so on relative mobility, I'll give you a little bit of non-doom and gloom spiel. There's a sense, I think, that the U.S. is sort of distinctively bad at mobility, and also that things are getting a lot worse with every day. You'll hear, unfortunately, I won't get to see her on the stage with Robert Putnam, but you will hear this from Robert Putnam in a few weeks, that the American dream is fading, that opportunity is declining. The evidence for that just is not there, and I'll caveat everything I'm about to say by saying that we don't know how today's kids will be doing as adults. We'll have to wait 30, 40 years to see that. But we do know about today's 40-year-olds, and we can compare them to the last generation of 40-year-olds and the generation before that. And when you do that, it turns out that sort of mobility we're talking about, relative mobility, upward mobility from the bottom, hasn't declined over this period of time. The Chetty study, you've all been focused on a Chetty study that's about geography. He did a second one that's about time trends, finds no worsening over time. That was just the latest in a series of a dozen papers over the years that basically find there have been just minimal changes over time. Now that's not to say that's fantastic news, right? I mean, things were pretty bad 2 generations ago, and they're still bad today. So I don't want to make this a big selling point that you declare victory and go home. But I think it's important not to be too pessimistic as well. Similarly, comparing the United States to other countries, the evidence up until very recently actually did tend to indicate that we lagged most of our peers. There's a really important paper in October last year that came out where an American, Canadian, and Swedish team of economists each analyzed data from their own country, did it very carefully, coordinated as much as possible, and at the end they found that the United States actually doesn't have any less upward mobility than Canada and Sweden, which is remarkable. It's sort of the first time this finding has been found. On the other hand, I've got a couple slides. So this is a slide where the Scandinavian countries are from a paper by a Scandinavian team of researchers from a few years ago. Their data point for the U.S. wasn't as comparable as for the other countries, and they found the U.S. looked a lot worse. The number at the top for the United States is actually from Pew that everybody keeps referencing, or actually worked a couple jobs ago. And you can see, the upward mobility in the U.S. a little bit worse, but not dramatically worse. I mean, the difference between the United States and Sweden, we're talking about the difference between 25% of kids who start at the bottom remaining in the bottom versus in the United States 31%. So this compares fathers to sons on their earnings. So pretty striking. I think it's something to keep in mind. This isn't something where the U.S. sort of has. I think we have some structural problems in some ways, but I don't think we necessarily have structural problems that prevent us from improving on mobility. Let's see. All right. So what is the problem then? I think if we skip ahead to, I have a here's the problem slide. Okay, so here's the problem to my mind, and so now I'm back to doom and gloom. It turns out when you analyze the mobility data and do it distinctly, separately by race, you get really dramatically different findings for whites and for African Americans. So I have this on my phone. I'm not actually checking my email or something. But as you can see from the slide, so in this slide, you'll see it starts at 20 on the left. And the reason I start at 20, if we had perfect mobility, then if you were born in the bottom fifth, you'd have a 20% chance of ending up in the bottom fifth. You'd have a 20% chance of ending up in the second fifth. You'd have a 20% chance of ending up at each fifth, right? And that would be true if you're born at the top. It would be true if you're born at the middle. So in some ways, 20 is sort of perfect here. So what this chart tells you is if you started out at the bottom, what are the chances that you are still in the bottom as an adult? And you can see by these white bars, I mean, the levels of mobility for whites are pretty spectacular in some cases. If you look at the second set of bars, family income mobility for men, that number for men is 21%. I mean, if the world were a coin flip, where anybody in this audience, where it was going to be random where you ended up, it would be 20%. So for instance, among white men, family income mobility is extremely high. Compare that instead with African American men, where it's 50%, and you get the same results going through. Interestingly, there's the differences between white women and black women in terms of earnings at the very bottom of the chart are not that big. And I would contrast that with, in the middle of the chart, if you look at immobility for family income, black women have much less mobility than white women for family income. And that, I think, points to some of these issues around family structure. And I've got another slide on that coming up. But just the dramatic differences between how much mobility there is for blacks and whites, I think, is something that we've really not faced up to as a whole. The next slide is the same thing, except downward mobility from the middle. And once again, you see fairly sizable differences. In a perfect world where there was perfect mobility, then you would see all these bars lining up at 40, essentially. You'd have a 40% chance if you started in the middle of ending up in one of the bottom 2/5, right? And so, for whites, again, it's around 40, or it's better than 40. For African Americans, it's more around 50, even 60. And again, actually, you find this really interesting finding of fairly high earnings mobility for black women, higher than for white women, actually, in this instance. Except when you go to family income, and then you find the big black-white differences again. Okay, just a couple other quick slides. So what's going on? I mean, I think the bottom line is anyone that tells you they really know what's behind either black-white differences in mobility or just sort of what's behind mobility to begin with is way more overconfident than they ought to be, maybe selling you a bill of goods. So conservatives look at the numbers I've shown you and they say it's family breakdown, and frankly there are pretty stark black-white differences in all the things on this chart in terms of out-of-wedlock births, early childbearing, teen childbearing. And so, I think there's nothing to the conservative case. Now, how I interpret that is not that we should encourage people who find themselves in tough circumstances with unplanned pregnancy, that we should encourage them to marry. I think we ought to not discourage them from marrying. I don't think that getting them to marry or keeping them married is necessarily going to be this magical key that unlocks all of their problems. I think the way to think about this is if we could convince more people to delay starting their family until they're in a better place with a better partner, then I think that's probably a better approach. I'm not at all trying to be judgmental. I have a 5-year-old that I share custody with myself, but I do think that there are a lot of advantages for a kid to have two parents that are in the home in a good relationship. Okay, last slide. Liberals see the same numbers and they say, well, it's segregation. And I think the liberals have a very strong case on this as well. This chart is from Pew, a report we commissioned when I was there by one of my grad school friends, Pat Sharkey, who's a sociologist at NYU. I encourage you to check out his work. Pat is a specialist in neighborhood poverty and concentrated poverty. So we asked Pat to look at the relationship between mobility and neighborhood poverty, and it turns out, as you would expect, there's a pretty strong relationship. But the really striking chart from Pat's report. So on the left side, there are two bars, and this is a generation that was born between 1955 and 1970. And what Pat was able to do is actually look back over their entire childhood and average out, in a typical year in their childhood, what was the poverty rate in the neighborhoods that they lived in. And what you see on that chart is essentially the blue and the green lines. If you compare whites to blacks, about 4% of whites experience the level of neighborhood concentrated poverty that 2/3 of African American kids experience. So we saw that number. At first, the left side was the only side we had, and we were pretty astonished. I have a PhD in sociology and have a well-stocked bookshelf of black-white inequality books, and I found this pretty shocking. And I thought about it, and I was like, well, Pat, these were people born in 1955, 1970. The civil rights movement hadn't even really kicked into gear by the time they were born. Surely we've made progress. We've got this other data set. Can you do the same thing, except for kids that were born 1985 to 2000? And that's what Pat came back with. Two charts that are basically indistinguishable from each other. So it remains the case that only about 6% of white kids experience the level of concentrated poverty that 2/3 of black kids do. So even when you compare, I think, poor whites and poor blacks, it's really not apples to apples. And so these are super tough issues. I don't think anybody really knows where to begin on making progress on either of them. I think the local level is actually probably the most appropriate place, in particular, to tackle segregation and concentrated poverty. So hopefully you all will figure out ways to do that.
Thank you. Russell, your organization is working in states, but also at the federal level, trying to develop policies that promote movement, opportunity, work, things like that. Tell us how you're thinking about this.
Really thrilled to be here, especially this is almost like a high holy day, right, in college basketball world, so I'm really impressed that this many people are here to talk about this important issue and probably also dreaming of this afternoon. Carolina doesn't play until tonight, though, right, so you got some time, and then I don't know what Duke plays, but today or tomorrow. And there may be North Carolina State fans, I don't know, we've got lots of teams here, but really great to be here. So this is exciting to me. So the organization I work with, as was mentioned, works on the opportunity divide at the national level. We're a bipartisan advocacy campaign. And we are working with that very difficult political climate that Bruce talked about. I'm not naive about that. And so I will underline some of what he said and maybe give a couple of pockets of optimism in the midst of all that. But as has been said, the truly interesting work is happening here, and it's happening in communities. So thrilled to be here and to learn from you all. I just want to say a couple of things really briefly, and I know we're going to move to some discussion. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about young adults, who I think are a really big piece of this discussion, and Opportunity Nation has chosen to focus on them as the piece of the opportunity puzzle we're going to really throw our energy into. First of all, at an elected official level, we fight about everything, and everything has become partisan, but everybody agrees young adults should have a chance and should do well, and should get to be able to get on to that first job ladder and to get the training to do that. And so it's a good place to start for that reason, but it's also a good place to start because when young people do well, communities do well. We've developed a tool called the Opportunity Index. You've already had a lot of data thrown at you, so I don't want to pile on too much. Check it out later on today while you're watching basketball. But opportunityindex.org is the site, and it really tracks closely with the Chetty study. We've done some work with their team to kind of overlay our scores with their scores. But this is a tool that takes 16 data points and gives every state and county a score. What's the high school graduation rate? What's the internet access rate? What's the access to healthy food rate? Basically, what are the conditions in a community that build a foundation on which people can then climb the ladder and then move into this upper mobility discussion we're having here? If you're living in a place where the culture is that only half of kids finish high school on time, many people don't have high-speed internet access at home, banking institutions are limited. Those things matter, right? If the violent crime is such that you don't feel comfortable walking down the street to green space in your neighborhood, in the aggregate, these things matter. And individual action and ambition is also important, and people can overcome those circumstances. But for way too many Americans, zip code has a lot to say about how high they can climb. And that's why I think some of the graphs, even showing the greater Charlotte area that showed, even in some of your outlying counties, some of the differences and some of the segregation, that really tracks with our Opportunity Index, where the scores are really, really varied. So even as we have this rich upper mobility debate about how bad is it worse than it used to be or not, is it worse than other countries or not, what we know is true for sure is that place matters a lot within our country, and matters a lot more than I think we want it to, right? We want to live in a country where everybody has a shot, no matter where you happen to be born, and no matter which parents you happen to get in the parent lottery. But those two things have a lot to say about how well you can do. And this Opportunity Index tool helps exemplify that. So I want to drill down on one piece of it that's focused on young adults. So one of the indicators that we measure is the rate of youth disconnection. So these are young adults 16 to 24 who are both out of school and work. Some people really close to this issue in the field have started calling them opportunity youth, which I think is great because it talks about young adults as assets, right? But that's not a term that's really caught on yet broadly. So these are often called disconnected youth, but they're on the sidelines of our economy. They've either left high school, they've aged out of foster care, maybe they finished high school and haven't been able to find a job. Perhaps they cannot afford a higher education path. And then there's 1,000 other reasons you'd become disconnected. Perhaps they experienced or witnessed violence in their community, or themselves have had some interaction with the criminal justice system, which I'm going to say more about, and we've already heard about. And because our society's decided to put a bunch of barriers in their path, they cannot re-engage. So there are about 5.6 million young adults in the entire country who are disconnected. Now, there are millions more who are very tenuously connected to the job market. So this is not the entire universe of challenge that we're facing. But between 1 in 7, 1 in 8 of the young adults in our country are disconnected. That's a really big number, especially when you think about the fact that more than just those 1 in 7 are having a really tough time. But about 1 in 7 don't have a job and are not in school at all. What does that look like locally? I took a look at our index for some of the local data. Mecklenburg County proper on the Opportunity Index actually has still over 13% of young adults are disconnected, but that's just a little less than the national average. But I looked at a couple of the nearby counties as you look at the entire metropolitan area, which I know this conversation is focused on. In Gaston County, am I saying it right? 18.5% of young adults are disconnected. I looked at a couple of, these are certainly smaller population-wise. Anson County, which I know is a smaller county, so the N is smaller, but about 29% of young adults are disconnected. So in that situation, you're growing up in a culture where a third of your peers are out of school and work once you hit age 16. That's a big deal culturally as far as what are the expectations that are on you. It also speaks to how many on-ramps are we building? One of the big things we've been pushing as a campaign. And one of the bright spots I'm going to point to is we just convened a national summit around youth employment a couple of weeks ago in Washington. And one of the themes was we need to have multiple pathways. We've really done ourselves a disservice by saying you should finish high school, you should get a 4-year Bachelor of Arts degree, and then your life will be great. That's a fine path, and I would never denigrate that path. I did that. It's worked out okay. But for a lot of young adults, especially in some of these communities, the best jobs, the best paying jobs, and the most prevalent jobs, as Bruce was saying, are in fact these middle skill jobs. And you all know this. I know there are pockets of excellence here in Charlotte doing this. Jobs that require education beyond high school, certainly we need everybody to get a credential beyond high school of some kind, but that don't necessarily require a 4-year degree. We really think that's the sweet spot where we can drive down this rate of disconnection, because what we've done is we've built these bottlenecks where only a small number of young adults can get through, and I want to partially refer to that because Richard Reeves, who we all love and respect, who couldn't be here, has done a lot of work on this issue of bottlenecks. We've built a bunch of those at different choke points in our culture, and as a result, a lot of people are left out and cannot get through that small space. So let's build lots of pathways and open those bottlenecks up. Part of that is businesses partnering with community colleges. Part of that is also changing the incentive structure, which I'm so excited. There's a theater full of people here today that want to do that. There are this collective impact model Bruce talked about, I think has got to be where the future is going, where we break down some silos, all the sectors are at the table, and we really talk about, all right, what's our end goal? How do we want to move up in this mobility ranking, and then how do we get there? And let's stop having these turf battles, right? We've got a lot of people that protect their program. They raise money for their program. They fight for a government, either a government grant or a foundation grant, and they report to their board. And they're very well intentioned, and their program is probably doing some good things. But we need more of those people to step out of that silo and to sit at a common table, as you all are building here, which is really exciting, and say, okay, what do we want to accomplish? Whether it's getting more 3- and 4-year-olds in preschool or whatever it is, and say, what are the assets we have to bring, and how do we all work on that? Businesses need skilled workers. They can't sit off to the side and say, this isn't my problem. They're hurting, and the workforce is aging. They need skilled workers. And so the places where this stuff's working, I think, the companies are sitting down with their community colleges and backing up their K-12 system and saying, let's build pipelines that have good jobs at the end. One of the only productive things the last Congress did, so I agree with Bruce's pessimism that you should not wait for the cavalry. They are not coming. Keep at it here locally. But the last Congress did pass a reauthorized Workforce Investment Act, which is a little bit of a wonky bill, and it's not perfect, and it's not going to fix all of our problems. But it is a step in the right direction, and so it passed with overwhelming bipartisan majorities in the Senate and the House, and the President signed it. So I do see that as one predicate. That bill provides a lot of the job training dollars the federal government kicks out that oftentimes go to local workforce investment boards. And there were a couple of key changes this time that many of us pushed for, I'm sure many of you did as well, to target dollars both to in-school and out-of-school youth, and to also make sure local workforce needs are considered when training programs are built. So let's not just have a program that's been around and we keep kicking out somebody with this skill set if in fact no good job is sitting at the end. That means we have to be dynamic, right? The economy is changing rapidly. It also means we've got to sit at common tables, break down silos, and collaborate across sectors, which I'm really excited is a part of the focus today. So just the last couple of things I would say in kind of conclusion on this youth piece in particular, which I think is so critical. On our opportunity index, and again, this is a little wonky, but when you run a correlation between any of the data points we look at and a community's overall score, the youth disconnection rate and the poverty rate are the two most correlated. So in other words, if you got all these levers you could pull, if you want to pick one, those are the two that would have sort of an outsized impact on how the community is doing. Which sort of hopefully tracks with your lived experience, right? The more young adults that are on the sidelines, they're not paying taxes, they're not joining groups, they're not developing social capital and networks, which is how you often find jobs, right? You find a job through someone you know versus just a cold posting that you see. And so these are all kind of ripple effects from communities that have larger rates of disconnection, which unfortunately the larger Charlotte metro area does have, among the 25 biggest metro areas, does have a larger rate of youth disconnection. Again, it varies greatly by county and neighborhood, but in the aggregate, it's pretty high. So what are some things that we can do? Keep convening people, keep at it. I'm so glad you all are launching this task force. I know it's really hard work building trust and relationships. Don't give up. Even in very partisan Washington at the summit we just held, we saw glimmers of interesting things happening. I should say we didn't just have federal officials, we had governors and mayors, which the conversations with them were frankly more interesting. But we made sure that we had lots of advocates on the ground. We also had lots of young adults in the room. So I would encourage you, whatever problem you're tackling, make sure the people that it affects most specifically are there, telling their story. They're not a prop. They're on the panel. They're in the conversation. So at this event, we had about a quarter of the attendees were under 25, and they were saying, "Here's what it's like to be 20 in my neighborhood. These are the jobs we have and don't have. These are the training programs I can access." And so it really puts a face on the challenge to stay close to the problem. So keep convening people, keep doing things like today and the task force that you're getting ready to launch, because that'll break silos. A couple of more specific things, I think, around young adults, where I do see some bipartisan energy is juvenile justice reform. There's some, maybe they're new converts, but we're happy to have them on the Republican side and some folks on the Democratic side. I think this will continue to be a topic of debate. We're never going to have an opportunity nation, if you will, or we're never going to have an upwardly mobile city of Charlotte when all of our young nonviolent offenders cannot re-engage. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense at all. And so we've got to find some ways to lower those barriers. That means businesses at the table, and they're making some hard choices about how their HR department looks at talent. We also need to probably remove, there's a lot of jobs that don't require college degrees that say that they do on the form and filter out a whole bunch of talent, right? That job might actually require an associate's degree or a credential or a set of, I hate to call them soft skills because it denigrates them, of application skills or whatever you want to call those skills that frankly are often just as important as the hard ones. So how do HR departments think about wider pipelines of talent and not filtering people out? So some of this is a policy solution. There's some things around juvenile justice we can do at the policy level, and we should. And some of it are practices and norms in our hiring and the way we interact with each other. One other small thing I would say, and there's a bill that would help make this happen too, that Senators Coons and Rubio, a Democrat and a Republican, have supported, that would take a really small step in this direction at the federal level. Every kid, when they start kindergarten, should have a savings account for higher education. I know there are parts of the country where that is the norm. We should make that, again, you should be able to design it locally how you like and how it works for you. It doesn't have to be a federal mandate. But the fact that that is the norm, and then you could opt out of it if you wanted to, is the way we should go. There's research to show that an account in your name, even if there's not much money in it, and I know you're thinking, how are low-income people going to save money? An account in your name, even with a small amount of money, increases the odds that you will finish high school and go into some sort of higher education. So again, this is about what works for you. That money could go toward books or an apprenticeship program where there's some upfront costs around equipment maybe, or toward a college degree, whatever is the right path. But if we say to every young person, somebody's rooting for you, and ideally, maybe it's the government or maybe it's the local bank. There's some matching incentives along the way, right? The family gets $200 and they get 50 thrown in by wonderful partners like Bank of America, right? We're in Charlotte, or whomever. You can do that in different ways, but it says to that young adult, people care about you, and they are already planning on you succeeding and finishing high school and doing something beyond that. So those are a couple of small recommendations we've been pushing for that I think in the aggregate can make a difference, especially for young people, which I think is a huge part of the challenge. So I would just end on, yes, the challenges are huge. The partisanship is really, really tough. So I'm not here to say we're going to figure all of this out. But I do think the fact that we're having an opportunity debate and that the 2016 campaign appears that it will at least in part be about the opportunity divide in our country is a good thing. And whoever the nominees are, I can imagine a world in which they would embrace parts of this agenda. But again, we're not going to wait and rely on them. We're going to be doing the hard work locally as you all are, which is so exciting. So thanks. Great to be here.
So I want to come back to this issue of bipartisanship and what we think the opportunity, because all of you have worked in a realm where you have either passed policies that have benefited the individuals you work with, or working with candidates, or shaping the agenda. But I'm curious first, I sort of went down the row and each of you got to talk and no one got to challenge or ask a question. Were there any things that you said yes but, or that you wanted a little more information or reaction to the initial data that Owen shared? Just don't know if there were any thoughts on the panel before we go into some questions about what each of you maybe said.
I mean, there's some common themes here, clearly, which, if you listen, I think everyone touched upon the sense that we have an education system in this country that basically walked away from vocational education, apprenticeship, what we used to call shop, right? I mean, and we basically convinced everyone that the only path to social mobility, upward mobility, was by getting a 4-year degree. It's absurd. I mean, it's just completely absurd. I mean, it is no alignment with the economy we have today, or frankly, the economy we had 30 years ago. So, there are models out of there, and frankly, your community college working with Siemens is nationally recognized as basically bringing over the German model and beginning to infuse it in the Charlotte economy. And, so I think, tending to focus on, the common themes and similar themes, I mean, that's a really big part of the solution here.
Yeah, I would just add, part of the challenge is there's a real stigma around other pathways we've got to knock down. Even when you say vocational ed, people think of like the 70s era, and that's really not what it even is anymore. And you guys know this because of the innovative thing. It's health IT, it's advanced manufacturing. And so I think what we've got to do is expose people to those paths a lot earlier. You could finish high school and have no idea what the jobs are where you live, right? Like you could have one sort of lame kind of career day that might be your only exposure. Hopefully that's not the case in Charlotte-Mecklenburg public schools, but we've got to make sure that's not the case, right? Young adults, it's probably starting in middle school, but certainly early in high school when they're at the pivot point and might be on the verge of dropping out. For some of them, need to be brought to life by, hey, these are some of the cool jobs in your community. Start thinking about them now. Go spend time with someone for a day. We've got to have the flexibility in our system to allow that to happen. So I think I would totally agree with that.
One of the things that I think you talk about this whole notion of, bipartisanship. We see on the news almost every day that our infrastructure in this country is being challenged to a degree that sometimes, aren't you kind of scared to drive down a road to go over a bridge? But yet, we don't have the political will to create the kind of jobs program that would allow us to rebuild a necessary infrastructure that is state-of-the-art, moving us forward as a country, that would allow some of the folks that we talk about relative to opportunity to really get a shot at a job that will pay a family-sustaining wage where they contribute back to their community. I got a friend who has this quote. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I kind of understand where he's coming from. And this is kind of associated with gang-related activity, right? He says, the best way to stop a bullet is with a job. Right? And while I don't necessarily agree with him, I understand what he's saying. It's basically, if you give a person who's in a challenged situation an opportunity to work, you reduce the amount of time, theoretically, that they have to participate in these other kind of nefarious activities. So where is the political will for us to understand, do we want to continue to drive down roads and overpasses that have the ability to crumble right before us, right? And allow the bipartisanship that exist in our country to be the political rancor that exists in our country to continue to allow us not to move forward an agenda that really creates real opportunity. That's something that's low-hanging fruit that sits there. If you talk to Dr. Bob Lerman at American University and the Urban Institute, who's a strong proponent of apprenticeship, that's an opportunity to create the kind of pathways to jobs to training that will allow people to participate in the kind of building of our infrastructure that's real, that's here, and is needed.
I was just saying, I guess one place where I would probably take issue a little bit, I think, with, well, at least I would certainly disagree with the rest of the panel on, I think, is, again, not to be too pessimistic about things. So wage stagnation has certainly happened, particularly for men. But it's not the case. Often you hear exaggerated reports that earnings have actually fallen by 30%, 25%, big numbers like that, and that just hasn't happened. So what's happened with wages and earnings and family incomes is that the rate of growth has slowed a lot versus what it was in the 1950s and the 1960s, and in some cases it's stopped. Men's earnings haven't really gone anywhere in a couple decades. And since 2000, the situation, there hasn't been much in the way of growth since 2000. But it's still the case that in 2007, before the Great Recession, which was not a structural problem with the American economy, it was this big housing mess that we got into. In 2007, both the middle class and the poor were better off in terms of income than they had ever been in the United States. And we've actually cut poverty in half since 1965. So I think it's, again, like, I'm not trying to say, like, go home, this is not worth your time, because I strongly believe it is worth your time, but I don't sort of be defeatist, I think, and overwhelmed about everything sort of deteriorating, I guess.
Joe, when you think about, if Richard was in the seat, he would say he's written quite a bit on the fatherhood deficit, on this issue. When you think about the missing father or your own personal story, is it an economic issue? Is it a social issue? Is it a combination of the two? And if so, what are the policies, or what would you say a community needs to do to sort of look at this issue, specifically when it comes to fatherhood?
Well, I think it's a combination of the things you mentioned, in addition to how, as a society, we have viewed the role of men versus women. We socialized men in our country, going back to the days of our founding fathers, to be providers and protectors, to go to work and go to war. There are probably people in this room whose fathers, they have a relationship with their father. Their father has said and has provided for them, but has never had the capacity to say, I love you. Men, for some reason, we have a difficult time being that kind of nurturer in that way. But we also have issues where, we have sucked up, particularly in the minority community, we have sucked up large numbers of African American men. And if you look at data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, about 67% of the folks who are incarcerated happen to be parents. So we're sucking up large numbers of minority men out of our communities into the criminal justice system. So you're taking out of the fabric of the community a kind of like controlling force within the lives of children. Right? Men have this unique, you ever go into a room full of children who are like all over the place, right? And when a man goes in with that strong personality and voice, children just react a little bit differently. And it's not that mothers and fathers are better than one another. It's that we bring complementary roles to raising and engaging our children. And when you don't have one half of the conceiving partnership engaged in the development of a child, that's a missing element. So this whole notion of father absence in our country, it compounds the challenges that children have trying to work through all this minutia that we're talking about when moms have to play the role of being a parent, a caregiver, being engaged in the labor force, and the children don't necessarily have the ability to be managed by two people. So this whole notion of it, which is controversial in terms of healthy marriage, I think healthy marriage does have a place in terms of what we think about as an institution in our country, but it's not the only way in which families today are formed. And so this changing, face of family has to be respected, it has to be understood, and we have to think through what are the ways in which we engage parents a little bit differently than we've always thought about them, so that we make sure that dads are engaged in the lives of children, independent of the romantic relationship between he and the mom.
Thank you. Bruce, you've talked a lot about this, the devolution of authority down to the metropolitan level. Is that metropolitan meaning that it's incumbent upon local public sector to move these issues, or is there a role for nonprofit organizations, the business sector, the faith sector, to drive some of these issues, especially when we start talking about, there are many people in the room today who are parts of some of our big initiatives around literacy, around education reform. Thoughts on sort of what are the roles for individual sectors within a community to play?
Yeah, I think we're struggling with this as a country because the language we tend to use around solutions in the United States, federalism, devolution, is really the language of government. But that's not really what this country is about. I mean, we're essentially a large private-public civic enterprise, right? I mean, if you compare us to Europe, or even the emerging nations, China, India, et cetera, this is a country that tends to basically devolve responsibility for different aspects of our domestic life, like infrastructure, actually, to the private and civic sectors. A large portion of infrastructure in the United States, the hand of government actually doesn't touch with large amounts of subsidies or resources. It tends to be designed, financed, and delivered by private and civic interests. And so I think we're struggling in many respects with many of these issues because we're still in this world of government, with the federal government and states as the constitutional sovereigns, and cities and metros vary dramatically across place. But the way in which the country actually rolls is as a network of different institutions taking on different responsibilities for a whole bunch of crazy historical reasons, So I'm actually writing another book, just because, called The Metropolitan Manifesto, which tries to reflect the nation who we are, and a lot of this goes back to the historic nature of, we broke away from Britain, et cetera, and we really evolved in a very, very, very different way than any other nation on this earth. Now the good news about that, the good news is that the capacity to solve problems in this country across these multiple dimensions, the verticality of government, federal, state, metro, local, and the horizontal of different sectors is immense, but just hasn't been tapped because we've been operating in these kind of, constructs which might work for Britain, it might work for Germany, it might work for Brazil, but doesn't really reflect who we are. So I think, essentially, and this really, I think, builds on many of the other comments, you all have the ability within your city and metropolis, right? Because that really is the unit of the economy. It's the labor market, it's the housing market. It's the way the economy organizes itself in this country and around the world. You do have the ability to set agendas and then set essentially an investment perspectives, right? We're Americans, right? I mean, we're capitalists, right? I mean, an investment perspectives of how you actually go about building and retrofitting infrastructure, investing in our children, investing in the skills that's aligned to your markets and your clusters and your sectors, building a quality of place where people have access to opportunity, both within their neighborhood and across the metro, and then going about and getting it done. I mean, and what will that all do when you actually go through this exercise is you'll realize for a lot of the issues that matter to problem solving, the feds and the states are not as important that we've made them out to be. There's a mythology of their power. The power is actually here. And so I think we're going to have to develop a different language in this country about how we actually operate. Not as a system of government, but a system of governance that crosses multiple sectors and that really does have the capacity to problem solve at much greater levels than we've allowed ourselves to do.
Our time is flying by, so I'm going to ask our community leaders to come up and ask questions. Raquel Lynch with Crisis Assistance Ministry has become an outstanding resource for this community when it comes to poverty, those in challenged situations. Debra Campbell, our Assistant City Manager, a member of our Community Foundation Board here, and again, one of our community's great leaders, and Dee O'Dell with U.S. Bank, who will serve as the co-chair along with Ophelia Garman-Brown, Dr. Brown, on the Opportunity Task Force. So I'm going to turn it over to each of you. We've got 35 minutes or so to ask questions, and also I don't know what we're doing with our audience questions, but if there are those, we'll also try to take some of those as well. So why don't we start, Raquel?
I feel like I'm in a concert because I admire everyone on the stage, so thank you for sharing your words. I think there's a theme also of disconnect. I think Russell started that, but I think everybody has talked about whether it's disconnect of systems across sectors, the disconnect of family, the political views, and youth, which is really generational. I wonder, as a community that we want to make a difference, how do we actually move from that disconnect and make it an opportunity so we actually have a shared vision and we could accomplish what we are set out to do? And if you could give us some examples of cities in the United States that have accomplished that.
I can give a quick response. I think part of it is these can't be viewed as altruism plays, and I doubt that that's the way you all look at it. But as you're convincing other people to join you, this is a triple bottom line thing, right? Like, we will all be materially better off if young adults are plugged in and succeeding, if they're connected, right? This is not just about, I feel badly for this young person on my street that's having a hard time. I mean, that's great to be motivated by your heart and to care about them. We're human, we feel that way. But we should also emphasize, especially to allies who are harder to get in the game and to get engaged on this stuff, that we're all going to be better off, right? Their business is going to have skilled workers, and that's going to mean we have a bigger tax base, and the community is going to do better. So I think trying to shift the model to, doing good by doing well, and that this is not just, well, all right, how much can we afford to give to this population, whatever it might be, so that we don't feel too badly about it. We've got to get away from that kind of a guilty mindset and more toward a collective impact mindset. So I think that's part of it. We've got some great partners, and this is sort of this is a top of mind example because I just was with them recently, but in Des Moines, Iowa, who are doing some really effective work where they've got really strong partnerships where their big employers are at the table, which for them, that's kind of an agricultural, the John Deeres of the world, but also a lot of advanced manufacturing companies are working hand in glove with the community college and the K-12 system to really build some strong pipelines. They also have, I don't know if this is a struggle here for you all, they have a bit of a brain drain where young adults often will leave because they feel like once they finish high school, there's nothing interesting to do in Iowa. So they're trying to also combat that by making sure people are aware of opportunities.
Yeah, for us in Baltimore, so we have this interesting model that's a partnership between my organization, Department of Social Services, and Johns Hopkins Hospital. And what the model entails is that women who receive public benefits are approved by the system to come to us for soft skills or essential skills training. It's 4 weeks, 9 to 5. If they successfully complete, then they are able to go to a 5-month internship program at Hopkins. They also are able to maintain their state benefits while they're at Hopkins, and they go through 5 different rotational job experiences at Hopkins. If they successfully complete, then they are picked up as full-time employees within Hopkins, which includes access to tuition assistance and then coaching so that they, as employees of the system, learn how to matriculate through different jobs up the mobility chain at Hopkins. That then, that model then was picked up by the state through the Department of Labor Licensing and Regulations through an initiative called EARN. I forget what the exact acronym is, but it's sort of like a rapid attachment to job opportunities. So what that has translated into, we now have a conglomerate of the major hospitals in Baltimore who are coming to table with us in a group called the Baltimore Association, the Baltimore Alliance for Careers in Healthcare, that are looking at replicating that and sort of like getting the hiring managers, getting back to a point that was raised about how do we get hiring managers to the table to get them to relax some of the restrictions they have on taking people with challenged backgrounds. So we now have this interesting partnership that now is sort of like at the macro level between the major hospitals and other institutions that are looking at how we replicate that model to get people into real jobs within the healthcare sector. The big challenge is on the male side of the equation, because you can't, in some of the more clinical jobs, you can't have a criminal record, right? So you can go to school and get the credential, but if you have a criminal record, the state boards will not allow you to apply. So there's some policy advocacy work that needs to happen on that level as well.
I would just say, you want to go to places that had a shock, had a crisis, and then had a complete freak out. Okay, because that tended to drive collaboration across multiple sectors. Denver, the collapse of oil and gas in the early 80s. San Diego, the defense conversions that began to happen under Reagan in the early 80s. Pittsburgh, the collapse of steel in the late 70s. These places have come back. They've diversified their economies. They've done it across the corporate, civic, and political sectors. And a lot of it is bottom up, frankly. Yeah, the state's engaged occasionally. The feds, it's hard to say the feds ever did much of anything intentionally. This really was locally driven. And there are American success stories, and then there are European success stories that went through the same kind of deindustrialization. So, you know, the challenge always with a place like Charlotte is you're not having a freak out, you know, because, hey, you know, I mean, Owen had it, right? I mean, it's a great place to live, and, you know, the population's growing, and hey, it's all, I mean, so you got to wake up every morning. I'm from Brooklyn, New York, so it's very easy to get into the mindset of things are really bad, you know. You know, not now in Brooklyn, but when I grew up. So, it's like a paradigm shift of how you think about, you know, are we really succeeding? You know, and that's why it's so helpful for Owen to walk through those, that data point. And there are other data points around, frankly, advanced industry and the innovative economy and the traded economy, which at the end of the day is what drives most of everything else. You should be freaking out. And then you can go to Denver, San Diego, and Pittsburgh, and a few other places, and really begin to understand how they marshaled the will across before we even knew what the word collective impact meant. You know, they marshaled the will to really turn the corner.
The other thing I'd say is, in terms of connectedness, you know, I think there's a lot of improvements that could be made to sort of local programs and even social delivery, things like that, that actually connect people within the community to each other. So you can think of social capital to outside of sort of low-income neighborhoods, for instance, or building social capital within the neighborhood. There's a couple examples of programs that I try to plug when I can. First is Mauricio Lim, I think, has a program called Family Independence Initiative in California. And essentially their approach is they only will help people if sort of a group of community folks come together as a group and say, you know, we want to do something, we have an idea, will you help us do it? And then they sort of seed fund what they're doing, and they do the sort of kind of alternative certification that you were talking about that sort of helps previously incarcerated, for instance, get jobs later on. Another example I recently just became familiar with is a group called the Lena Foundation, which has built devices that kids wear and that record the words that are said to the kids. And the idea is that you try to help parents talk to their kids more and reduce the word gap, which starts ridiculously early. And in one of their models, they have a whole curriculum that they've developed, and they encourage parents a group of parents to use these things and meet regularly and talk with each other about, well, what's working for you, what's not working, and to help each other that way. I mean, that's a way, I think, to try to rebuild some social capital that may be frayed, you know, in some places.
So, Debra, when we talk about the metropolitan revolution, and I think Bruce talked about the city and the state and the federal, I think we're somewhat locked in a battle right now between the city and our state legislature. And you and Ron, I saw Ron at one point, and I feel for you. But I know you're struggling every day to make this a better place. Questions for the panel?
Sure. Thank you, Brian. My question is a little bit more directed at each one of the speakers, if that's okay. So, Scott, how you doing? Great. Good.
Whoa. Was doing very well.
I forgot to warn everyone about that.
I'm just asking how he's doing. I get that you have some concerns about the data, and you kind of challenged it. But do you feel there is any need for any type of intervention related to economic opportunity or economic mobility? And if you do, then what would it be? Would it be, can you talk to me or the audience specifically from a public policy or public sector perspective and private sector initiatives or perspective?
Yep, absolutely. So I'll say I'm a little bit of a weird right-of-center person. I was a registered Democrat in 2012, so I'm in a little a little bit on the fringe of conservatism in some ways. And I'm actually writing an opportunity agenda for a funder where I've actually spent the last 2 months kind of locked in my apartment trying to figure out what exactly I would do. And I think, there are a few things that I would advocate for. I think, first of all, the social programs that we have that are intended to change the behavior or increase the skills of poor kids and of their parents have not been that successful, I would say. So, Head Start is the one that's probably that everyone's kind of hung their hats on, hoping it would work. And the evidence on Head Start is just not great. It appears to have effects over the first few years that then fade out. There's some non-experimental literature that claims that long-term effects sort of pop back up when they become adults. That I think we need more rigorous evaluations of that. But kind of case after case, if you sort of look at social programs and whether they're effective, it's a really depressing story. That's true not just of liberal programs. The marriage promotion stuff that George Bush put into the 2002 welfare reform bill failed miserably. The Oklahoma City came closest to having success, and I think it made couples happier about their relationship, but it didn't increase marriage. So it's in other sites, didn't even accomplish that. So I think there has to be a hard-headedness about the fact that we don't really know what models work. Within a broad approach like Head Start, we don't know, what specific things that people are doing, why those work, why some places are more successful than others. So I would actually I would build a federal Office of Opportunity in the White House. Richard Reeves has talked about this as well. I'd devote a big chunk of money, something on the order of $20 billion a year, to try to learn, how do we move more kids up by funding local efforts. I think the federal government ought not to be in the game of running big programs. I think it ought to be in the game of incentivizing a lot of experiments at the local level and then learning what works, funding that more ruthlessly, defunding stuff that doesn't work, by the way, and helping people learn from each other in different communities about what works and what doesn't. So I think an Office of Opportunity would be a real commitment to the goal of increasing upward mobility. I have some other things that I think are important. I do think that, and this will be controversial, I suspect, I think that safety net reforms along the lines of what we did with the cash welfare program in the 1990s, I think would help kids. I was somebody who, as a young 20-something in 1996, couldn't stomach that President Clinton signed this bill, and I was convinced it was going to do horrible things. Senator Moynihan famously said that there'd be 1 million kids sleeping on grates. And in fact, what happened is that work rates among single moms went up, poverty went down. There was a big 90s boom, and everyone thought, well, after this 90s boom is done, then we're going to be in trouble. It turns out the poverty rates didn't go back up. And even in the Great Recession, because we've built in supports like the Earned Income Tax Credit that support folks who want to work, the increase in poverty in the Great Recession, the worst downturn we had since the Great Depression, poverty went up by a couple of percentage points, which is far less than what happened in the 1980s recession and the 1990s recession. So I think welfare reform was a success, and that we ought to expand on those lessons. The other thing I really like is something called income share agreements, which would be a way to finance higher ed costs. The idea is you take away a few regulatory barriers, and you could actually create an investment market where people could come in and say, I'm going to pay for your college. You're not going to have to take out a loan. You're not going to have to deal with, what if I drop out and can't pay back the loan? What if I can't get a job that pays very well? In return, you will have a contract with the investor where you actually have to pay them, 4 or 5%, whatever, of your earnings for X number of years, and that's your obligation. Another neat thing about that is that it would hold schools accountable, because kids who were going to schools that were failing their students, the kids would see pretty lousy terms when investors came to them and said, well, you're going to have to give me 7% of your earnings instead of 4% because your school's a dropout factory. So that's another reform that I would advocate as well.
Well, that's about
The rest of them dodged a question from you, Debra? Oh, no. So, Dee, you've got a big job ahead of you, along with Ophelia Garman-Brown, as the head of the task force. Opportunity to ask some questions of the panel to help guide that work.
You bet. Thanks, Brian. And thank you all for being here today. This has been an incredible discussion so far. So as our task force begins its work in the very near future, we know that we are brought to the table by a study that ranks us 50th out of 50 on one metric. So one of the first things that we'll wrestle with is, what is the right long-term goal for us to measure our success over several decades? Is it just the one that brought us to the table, which is the movement from the bottom quintile to the top quintile over 30 years, which seems very, very specific. It got a great headline. But a bigger picture question for us is, how do we define success 20, 25 years out? And I think that will then guide us to a dashboard, as Brian said, which would be things could be measured yearly along the way. Are we making progress toward that goal? So I'd be interested from each of you, your perspective on what that long-term goal might look like.
I'll let them give a smarter answer than I will, but I would just say, I would say to maybe pair with that some other things, especially things that have shorter time horizons, because I think people need quick wins sometimes to feel bought. Now, you also don't want folks to be discouraged after 1 year when things don't move. So there's a lot of caveats here, but hitting singles and doubles is really important on this stuff, I think. And so if there are some things that you think you could see a quicker payoff on to also bake in, both because they'll show you're moving in the right direction, but also to give you something other than, are the kids born today doing better than their parents in 30 years, right? Which might have to be what essentially you would do to track with the Chetty report 30 years out. So, I live in Washington, D.C., which is a really sort of interesting and weird place because the federal government's there and sort of shields it from recessions, but then we have huge segregation and poverty issues in the city. But the last mayor made a big investment in, or maybe it was 2 mayors ago now, in early childhood education that we're really now seeing pay off. Like there's always a lag in data. It takes a while, but a lot more 3- and 4-year-olds are enrolled, and I think it's slowly having positive ripple effects on what's historically been a very bad public school system, frankly, that most affluent families sort of flee, and many of them still are, but they're keeping their kid in one grade longer than they used to, and they're sticking with their community school, so there's a lot more work to do there, but so there may be a couple of things like that where there's some investments you're making that might have a shorter time horizon as well.
I think you really have, frankly, a bigger challenge ahead of you, because when I think about North Carolina, what I'm mostly thinking about is Raleigh-Durham. I mean, as the innovative economy of this state that is in the 21st century. Charlotte is a financing hub. It's a logistics hub. It's got some nascent innovative activity. It's not really seen as an entrepreneurial place because you've got some big institutions here. And so the startup culture, right, which defines a lot of what happens in this country, is not as substantial as it needs to be. So I think you've got an economic restructuring challenge, which is also what New York City had to go to as a financing hub. They didn't have enough STEM in their system, right? They just did not have enough innovative activity, that's really driven by research and development, the commercialization of ideas, inventing discoveries for the market, whether it's in energy or life sciences or any number of critical areas. So you've got to diversify your economy, which San Diego did, by the way, which Denver did, by the way, which Pittsburgh did, by the way. And then you've got to change almost the culture of the place to be more entrepreneurial. And to move to a very different kind of economic model, which is less about big companies or big institutions, to more nimble and entrepreneurial players at all. I think you've got a bigger challenge here. And I think some of it you can grow from within, but you should be looking around the country and frankly the world to be thinking about which companies, which advanced research institutions should be here, and then go out and get them. You know, and you spend a lot of time, you know, I don't want to harp on this too much, spend a lot of time subsidizing a lot of stadia, when frankly you should have been investing in your kids, and you should have been investing in innovation. Look, we all love to go to the ball game, but at the end of the day, how much beer and hot dogs can you consume? You know, I mean, you wake up the next morning fairly sick, and you know what? If you're going about the business of really equipping workers and young adults with the skills they need to compete in this economy, you wake up feeling pretty good about yourself. So I think this agenda is really at the tail end of a much bigger issue around economic restructuring and envisioning a Charlotte 25 years from now that frankly the competitive middleweights of this world will look at and respect. And what they respect is really only one thing, and that's innovation.
So, if you could, when we looked at some of the maps and those concentrated areas of segregation and poverty, if you could break up some of that concentration of poverty, some of that segregation, but give some thought to a couple of things. One, in my experience working with people who are struggling to fight their way out of that, and assuming you can create economic opportunity for people, right, is that so much of what happens is as you begin as an individual to advance, sometimes you feel so damn guilty that you're able to advance, and the people within your own social network, including your family, they're not able to advance. So it's almost a psychological tug that keeps you from advancing as far as you could because you don't want to leave the people who are closest to you behind. And that psychological hurdle is almost invisible, that you can't touch it, but it sits there. And if you're black and you live in poverty, you know it, you have conversations around it, but it's one of those kind of conversations that's not necessarily something that we always talk about. And then, assuming you can control for that, you have conversations around, you can do some coaching around what it takes to actually move forward, not feel guilty about it, you know, but how can you do things to extend an olive branch back to other people in your community, but not hold yourself hostage to their outcome, right? Complicated stuff, but necessary. But you don't do stuff like what's happening in D.C., right, where you've had sort of like D.C. being a very poor community at one time, where the development in D.C. has dramatically changed some of the most impoverished sections of D.C., that the people who used to live there could no longer afford to live there. So the question is, as you begin to create these new economic opportunities, you are able to get people to psychologically break through the hurdle that may hold them down. How do you create spaces in your community where everybody can live? And it's not just for those who have the economic resources at the highest income level to be able to live by you and through gentrification. So how do you make sure that you control for those kind of things, that you can explore the opportunities and the goals that you set for yourself?
Let me ask, we've got some great questions from the audience and from Twitter, and I think this question probably could take us the next week to answer. But it is something I think as we explore all the options that when you look at opportunity for a community, a lot of people jump straight to this issue of earnings and wages. And the question from Twitter was, what are your thoughts on living wage controversy, especially things like Seattle's $15 minimum wage? Thoughts on that as a driver of opportunity, and maybe how the business community might react to something like that?
Well, the reality of the country is the federal government's trying to go to $10.10 an hour. And what's happening is states and cities and metros are getting to that level. Though this morning in the New York Times, I don't know if you saw that Target agreed to increase the wages on its workers to $9 an hour. So some of the private sector is already beginning to deal with this. You know, cities and metros have to at least go to what's being discussed at the federal level. In D.C., I think the city and Prince George's and Montgomery County in Maryland agreed to go to about $11.50 in a phased way. What's really important, so yes, America needs a pay raise, and it needs to happen at this level because it's not going to happen, frankly, at the other levels. The question, though, is can you do this as a metropolis? Because if you just do it as a city, though you're a fairly large city, you're going to have some distorting effects. I think this is the challenge with Seattle. Seattle did this as a city. It sits within King County. It sits in a multi-county metropolis. A lot of jobs, particularly good jobs, are going to begin to drift over the borders. You know, why not? So I think it's really important to do this as the broad metropolitan community. But yes, you should be acting on this. $15 may be too high a price to bear, but you should definitely be getting to what these other cities have done, 10 and 11.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, you know, I get nervous about markets, and I get nervous about how businesses react to things that I think too often people are able to sort of not think about the potential consequences of things that feel good to do. So raising the minimum wage a little bit, the research tends to show doesn't have very much net impact on employment. So some people get a raise, and not many people on net lose their jobs. That's on net, though. So when you change the minimum wage, you're inducing some people into the labor market. You know, affluent teens, stay-at-home moms, and so some people are going to displace other people that had jobs. And so looking at net employment makes me a little bit nervous that the people that we're trying to help, that it's not going to help them. Moving from 725 to 1010 in a matter of a few years is a 40% increase. We've seen an increase that big once. It finished up during the beginning of the Great Recession. I don't think it helped anybody who was looking for work during the Great Recession. In real terms, in real purchasing power terms, that would be higher than we've ever had as a minimum wage if you adjust things for the cost of living correctly. And then we would index it at that. So forevermore, it would be at a level that we don't really have any good evidence to say one way or another whether that's $15, you know, the equivalent of being way too high. So I think you have to be careful about raising the minimum wage. I think small changes, you know, probably would help more people than they'd hurt. But I think it's important to take the unintended consequences into account.
Thoughts, Joe? Or I guess, you know, when Richard was here, I think one of the questions that he raised was whether minimum wage actually improves, it gives you more money in your pocket, but is it really giving someone a vision of a better future that would exceed minimum wage? You know, that's not the goal. The goal is to move to middle income, to get a great job that you're happy with, that you provides for your family. So I think that was the other question that sort of Richard challenged us with. Is minimum wage the focus area, or should it be a focus area? So.
Yeah, that's the point I was going to make. I think in general, increasing it a little bit from where we are is good. And it's interesting that the Target announcement follows very closely in Walmart's announcement, which shows that within the sector, you know, when the biggest company in the country does something, it pushes other people, which that can have negative effects sometimes, but in this case, I think probably was a good thing. And that probably also was a response to a lot of advocates pushing really hard, so it shows that people's voices do matter. Ultimately. But I think what was exciting to me about the Walmart announcement, the wages got all the ink, but they also announced some new pilots, which they're still building out what they're going to look like, but they're going to try to build some stronger pathways within their stores where employees gain more skills, and you're working in the bakery, but there's actually a path you can see to move into a managerial role, to try to cut down on churn, increase productivity and loyalty, and of course it's going to benefit them too, but it's going to benefit those employees, and also pair that with where it's easier to get a credential while you're working, They've got to figure out, is that online learning? Is that the local community college? Because the sorts of communities they tend to be in. So there's a lot to figure out. But to me, that was the more exciting part of the announcement, because I think that's the piece that Richard would speak to. You've got to have those routes. It's not like, well, now I make $9 and I used to make $7.50, I'm all set. I mean, obviously that's not true for anyone. I mean, it's a little bit more of a cushion if you're right at the edge, but we really need to be thinking about, way beyond that.
Can I just recommend one thing for your task force, though? Because, you raise wages, the other part of this is reduce prices. I mean, going back to Owen's, charts, right? This place, and this really builds on what Joe is saying, this is a just dispersed, decentralized metropolis. I mean, people are spending an insane amount of money on transportation to get to work, right? That's really the heavy part of the budgets here, right? And somehow we need to basically crack at that. So you're doing the wage side and you're doing the price side at the same point. And we did a lot of work on this going back about a decade ago in Philly and a bunch of other places. The price equation needs to be discussed, whether it's around housing and transportation, which are really the two big components of household budgets. So a bunch of folks should really focus on that and figure out a way to sort of, lower prices, essentially. And there's multiple ways in which to get at it.
So again, we have a lot of great questions from Twitter and from the audience. I'm going to try to find a way to get these answers to you, either follow-ups or in a later session. Debra, I'm going to ask you if you'd ask the last question for the community, and then I've got one last question to wrap us up this morning.
Again, I also want to thank you all for coming to Charlotte. I think this has been very, very productive for the community. My last question is, representing kind of local government, can you all touch on the role that you think local government, from a policy perspective, investment perspective, plays in either adversely or creating obstacles for economic opportunity, or a role that we can play to improve and enhance livability and opportunities for economic opportunity for our citizens?
So I sort of struggle, I usually am focused on federal policy, but in terms of increasing opportunity and mobility, to my mind, two big things I think that would make a big difference, but which don't really have a federal hook at all, would be occupational licensing and deregulating some of that. There are these crazy stories about, to become a florist, you have to have weeks and weeks of training, and we obviously all want our doctors that operate on us to be qualified, but occupational licensing has really gotten to the point where it's just protecting incumbents who are in the business and don't want competition. That's something you can't really do much about at the federal level, but states and localities could. Similarly, I mean, this as I'm sure a hornet's nest, residential zoning, a big part of concentrated poverty and segregation has to do with zoning within cities, in terms of not having enough housing versus commercial development, but also suburbanization, frankly, and suburbs that pass zoning laws in order to exclude people who want affordable housing. Those are not problems you jump right into and say, let's solve this, let's roll our sleeves up, and I mean they're thorny, but I think they're incredibly important for mobility.
I would just say that the informal power of government may be more important than in many respects the formal powers of government. The informal power is, particularly if you're elected officials, because they have democratic legitimacy, is to convene stakeholders from the private and the civic and the university and other sectors, so that you can crack at challenges across multiple sectors. And you can unlock capital that is really sitting on the balance sheets of corporations or universities or, frankly, within families, right? I mean, that's part of what's going on now, is we're beginning to recognize that in the U.S., it's not the responsibility of government, or it's not likely to be the responsibility of government to finance a whole bunch of stuff that we need to get done. It's going to have to be done through through these collaboratives. So this informal power, you know, I mean, I've been working with the mayor of Detroit. You know, Detroit's 38 square miles. It's a very, very large place. Like you, its downtown and its midtown is a very small landmass, but a very high percentage of the jobs. So the mayor basically said to the heads of Henry Ford Health, Detroit Medical Campus, and Quicken Loans, and all the other institutions and employers, tell me how we supercharge the innovation economy here. I have no money, you know, essentially, to do this. But let's unlock the capital, which has already been unlocked from philanthropy and business in that community. And then let's go to institutional investors, domestic and global, and begin to have the capital deployed so that we can grow business, grow jobs that radiate out to the rest of the city. That's informal power. That's the new power, I think, of cities. Because you are the engines of the economy, and government now, I think, has a very different role to play.
You know, one of the debates and conversations and current opportunities that sit out there are local hiring requirements, right? Where through the procurement process, municipalities require prospective vendors to commit to hiring at least 51% of folks from the local community to participate in jobs associated with those contracts. And an example of how that's translated for us in Baltimore. So Exelon, which is one of the largest utilities in the country, are building a new headquarters in Baltimore. And the contractors, who tend to be the ones who would get the contracts to work on the development of that project, will say, we can't find people in the urban community who are prepared to take advantage of those opportunities. Therefore, holding us accountable for a local hiring requirement doesn't make a lot of sense. But what that translated into, and this is a specific example, is that Exelon then created a slightly south of $500,000 workforce training project that was designed to train people, primarily men, from the community who didn't have a skill in the construction trade to get that skill, and then that they would be available to the contractors to hire to meet the local hiring requirement. So you had the municipality that said, if you get a contract through the city procurement process, 51% of the people who you hire have to be from the city. But then you had a conglomerate that received tax breaks from the city for their construction project, who also said, we will provide resources to train people from the community so that when we contract with contractors to build a complex, that they then had qualified people from the community who had a skill, and the people who were in the training programs could have a criminal background, so you weren't excluded from that sector. And so those are the kind of innovative things that can be done, although in some communities can be controversial.
So let me ask one last question here before we wrap up. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. You have a magic wand. You could do anything you want with one thing, move one lever. We know there's lots of things when it comes to opportunity. Knowing what you know about opportunity, about communities, what's that one thing you would recommend this community do?
This is like the plastics one. I mean, my one bit here would be apprenticeships. I mean, by the way, you have one of the best community colleges in this country. I mean, it's, and they are doing things, not just, when Siemens comes to town and prepare workers for Siemens, not a bad thing Siemens is here. They're also basically becoming the training ground for large manufacturing companies like Cummins. So they're taking kids into the system and basically providing the kind of high technical skills for an obviously STEM-driven manufacturing company that's competing at the global scale. So no American metropolis, none, basically has a system, and we can call it any number of things. Apprenticeships, you're right, the old language is the old language. If you embrace that as a community and you work on economic diversification concurrently, you will mark yourself as a place that is really finding talent, across the entire community. And I guarantee you, there are a lot of people in the corporate sector, in many different parts of advanced industries that will basically say, that's a place that gets it. Let's go there.
I would say that, if you are really intentional about, the ideas that are going to come from the task force that you want to move forward, a lot of, what will need to take place at the macro level, at the municipal level, also has to be translated on the ground in the communities where people live. And how do you assess the capacity of the stakeholders in those communities, the nonprofit sector being included in there? How do you assess their current capacity? And what is needed to build the right kind of capacity within that sector so that they have the increased ability to use data to manage from, right? That they have the ability to understand how to use the investment that people will make, whether it's from a foundation, whether it's from a corporate investment partner, to be able to use those resources prudently. So that when you have board governance, you don't have Cousin Pookie on the board and your grandmama, and those kind of things that really detract from the ability to build confidence that the sector has the capability to really execute on its fiduciary responsibility to investors. So really thinking from a business standpoint, because so much of the nonprofit sector are run by people like me, the do-gooders, who got good hearts, all in the right places, right? But in the helping professionals, and helping professions, schools of social work, allied health, you're not taught to run businesses, right? And so there's a real disconnect between, I got people on my board from the private equity community. Man, I can't tell you how I've gotten whipped to death over the 15 years I've run this organization, to the point where I no longer have a do-gooder conversation with folks on my board before we start talking about the business of the organization. So I'm sharing a little bit of my personal stuff, so don't y'all go out there and talk about it, right? But that's the challenge that we have to give to the people in our communities who are stakeholders in this game. Otherwise, what's going to happen, you're going to have all these folks coming from other places trying to do work in community, and it's going to be rejected by a certain segment of the community because it's not about the people who are there, who have the capacity to help contribute to this conversation.
Scott, your magic wand, you pick one thing, what are you going to do?
So a series of curse words went through my head when you first asked the question, but I'm really glad you did, because I didn't mention another program that I try to plug. So the one thing that I would recommend is something that the San Francisco schools are doing. It's a program called Ready for K, and it's ingenious, and it's had big effects. So all it is, it's a text messaging program. So parents, it's optional, parents sign up for it. If you sign up, you get 3 text messages a week. Turns out everybody, by the way, has text messaging. So I think there was a concern up front that you're excluding the poorest parts of the community. Everybody has text messaging. So parents get 3 texts a week. Basic things like today, say words that start with the same letter, and that's all it is. It's essentially free. Like, the program's developed. It's 10 cents a message, right? And it had big effects on how much parents interacted with their kids, and it had big effects on how much on kids' readiness for kindergarten. To me, that's super exciting. If it's cheap and local and works on young kids, you don't get any better than that.
Russell?
I would agree with all that. I love all the skills and apprenticeship stuff Bruce talked about. So I think to get there, I would say close the mentoring gap, right? So to do all the things we just talked about, you need a caring adult in your life, and we know that young people from families in the higher end of the income bracket have a lot of adults that care about them and will not let them fall through the cracks. Kids from low-income backgrounds need that too. And so I think if every kid, every young adult starting really early could have a mentor, I think then that sets the foundation to do all of this stuff and make sure they're on a pathway and they're closing that word gap. So I'd say
thank you. So please join me. First of all, I want to thank our community panel, Dee O'Dell, Raquel, Lynch, and Debra Campbell. And then I want to thank our panelists, Bruce Katz, Scott Winship, and Raquel Krumnow. Thank you, and don't forget about March the 18th with Robert Putnam, and we'll have a rollout soon of the task force and a lot more things that you can get engaged in. Thanks.